The radio crackled with static and desperation. 6 Navy SEALs pinned down, flanked on 3 sides. 1 machine gun nest chewing through their cover. An armored vehicle rolling in from the north, and 60 seconds before the whole team ceased to exist. The commander's voice came through hard and flat. "Iron Wolf Sniper, you're up." 940 meters away, in the dark, in the wind, in the freezing black of the Korvath Mountains, Lieutenant Maya Voss pressed her cheek against cold carbon fiber and breathed. Nobody laughed after that. If you've never heard her name, you're about to. Subscribe and drop your city below. Let me see how far this story travels. The briefing room at Red Talon Forward Operating Base smelled like burnt coffee, hydraulic fluid, and something older. The particular staleness of men who had been living inside concrete and stress for too long. Maya Voss stepped through the door at 06:15, and the room went through its usual sequence. First, the silence. That half-second pause where conversations didn't exactly stop, they just lost momentum, like an engine cutting out for a single rotation before catching again. She'd been reading that silence for 3 years. She knew every variation of it. The one that meant that's unusual. The one that meant she shouldn't be here. And the one she'd gotten this morning, which was a blend of both with something else underneath it that she couldn't quite name yet. She set her kit bag down at the empty seat near the back wall. Not the back corner, which would have read as hiding, but the back wall, which read as tactical. And she opened her notebook to a blank page. Master Chief Dennis Halder was already watching her from across the room. Halder was 41 years old, built like something carved from the side of a mountain, and had been running SEAL direct action teams for 11 years without a single man lost under his command. He wore that fact quietly, the way men who've earned things tend to do. He didn't say anything to her. He just looked, the way a man looks at something he hasn't decided what to do with yet. Petty Officer Second Class Tomas Breck was less subtle. Breck leaned toward the operator beside him, a younger guy named Wolf, and said something behind his hand. Wolf's face did a thing. Not a smile exactly. More like the corner of his mouth acknowledging that something had been said. Maya wrote the date at the top of her page, then the grid coordinates from the screen at the front of the room. Colonel Ethan Rourke walked in at 06:18, and the room actually did go quiet. That different quiet, the one made of attention rather than judgment. Rourke was not a large man. He was maybe 5'10" on a good day, lean in the way marathon runners are lean, with close-cropped gray at his temples, and a face that had been outside in bad weather for a very long time. He moved with the unhurried precision of someone who had learned, over many years, that urgency was most effectively communicated through stillness. He dropped a folder on the table and pulled up the satellite imagery on the display screen without preamble. Korvath Mountains, Northern Sector, grid reference 279er. He tapped the screen. This compound. You're looking at a hardened facility, former mining operation, converted and reinforced. Current occupant of interest, Captain David Rice, Defense Intelligence Agency. Captured 11 days ago during an extraction that went sideways in Sector 4. He is alive. He has information our command structure needs before it becomes irrelevant. A pause. The window to get him out closes in 36 hours. He turned from the screen. His eyes moved across the room in that particular way commanders' eyes move, cataloging, assessing, not lingering anywhere too long. The compound sits in a valley. Single road access, 2 sides against cliff faces. Guard rotation every 20 minutes. We have good imagery on the external layout, less certainty on the interior. The rescue element will have a 4-minute window from insertion to breach before the guard rotation creates a hard problem. Breck raised his hand. ROE? Permissive. Anyone holding a weapon outside that compound is a valid target. Rourke glanced at the imagery again. Approximately 18 to 22 fighters based on current pattern analysis. This is not a militia. These people have training, equipment, and they've had 11 days to look at that valley and think about every way someone might try to come in. The room was still. Overwatch will be the load-bearing element of this mission. Rourke pulled up a topographic overlay. There's a ridgeline here. Northwestern approach, roughly 900 meters from the compound's main gate. Elevation advantage of approximately 260 feet. Whoever holds that position controls the valley floor. He looked at Maya. Not the way Breck had looked at her. Not the way Halder had looked at her. Rourke looked at her the way a man looks at a tool he has decided to trust, with the particular directness of someone who has already done the math and arrived at an answer he intends to live with. Lieutenant Voss, that ridge is yours. The silence this time was a different species entirely. Breck found her in the armory 40 minutes later. She was at the workbench with her rifle broken down in front of her. A Chatak M200 intervention, .408 caliber, the kind of long-range precision instrument that required more relationship than technique. She was checking the barrel with a bore light, not because it needed checking, but because her hands needed something to do, while her head worked through the topographic details from the briefing. "Can I ask you something?" Breck said. It wasn't really a question. She didn't look up. "Go ahead." "Where have you been, operationally, before this?" "Afghanistan, 1 deployment, then 18 months stateside as a marksmanship instructor at SOCOM. Then here." Breck was quiet for a moment. She could hear him thinking. "1 deployment," he said. "That's what I said." "How many confirmed engagements?" Maya set down the bore light and looked at him. He was not being hostile, exactly. He was doing what operators do when they're genuinely worried about the person covering their back from 900 meters away. He was taking inventory. She understood it. She didn't have to enjoy it. "Enough," she said. "That's not a number." "No, it isn't." Breck's jaw moved like he was working through something. "Look, this isn't personal. But tomorrow night, 6 people are going in hot into a valley with no good exit, and the difference between all of us coming home and some of us not coming home is whether the person on Overwatch can actually do what she's supposed to do under pressure," Maya said, "under fire, with the clock running, with wind, with darkness, with multiple moving targets at range." She picked up the barrel and resumed her check. "I know what Overwatch requires, Petty Officer. I was teaching it until 4 months ago." "Teaching it isn't the same as—" "I know that too." Breck stood there for another few seconds. Then he left. She listened to his footsteps until they faded, and then she set down the barrel and looked at her hands. They were steady. She'd learned that from her father, who'd been a competitive long-range shooter before his eyesight went. He taught her that the hands were liars, that they felt the trembling even when it wasn't there, and they felt steady even when the fear underneath was genuine. The trick was not trusting either feeling. The trick was the breath, always the breath. She picked up the barrel again and kept working. Yeah. The Korvath Mountains at night were a different geography than they appeared on satellite imagery. The imagery gave you lines, terrain features, elevation markers, shadow patterns that suggested the shape of things. The actual mountains gave you cold that moved through body armor like it wasn't there, and wind that changed direction every 6 to 8 seconds in patterns that made no meteorological sense, and a darkness that was not the darkness of urban environments or even rural lowlands. It was the darkness of high altitude, thinner somehow, more absolute, a darkness that didn't hide things so much as erase them. The MH-60 Blackhawk came in fast and low, threading through the valley approaches at 150 knots with no lights. Maya sat against the port side bulkhead with the M200 case across her lap and watched the darkness outside the window move. Beside her, Halder sat with his eyes closed and his head back against the fuselage wall, not sleeping. She could see his breathing was too controlled for sleep, but somewhere inside himself doing whatever it was that men like Halder did before operations. Breck was talking quietly to Wolf about something. She caught fragments. Weather window. Northern approach. The guard count was off in Sector 3. Operational chatter, the kind that helped people settle. She didn't join it. Joining it would have been wrong. She was not part of their team in that way. She was the edge that would protect their team. There was a difference, and pretending otherwise would have been a kind of dishonesty. The crew chief held up 5 fingers. 5 minutes. Maya opened the weapon case and ran her check in the dark by feel alone. Scope caps. Elevation turret. Windage. The suppressors threading. She'd done it enough times that her fingers knew the sequence without instruction. She felt Halder watching her from 3 feet away. She didn't look up. "You zeroed at what range?" he said. It also wasn't really a question. 800. I'll adjust for target distance once I have eyes on the ridge. Wind up there is going to be bad. I know. The thermal crossover happens around 0400 at this elevation. Mirage layer, ground temp equalizing with Master Chief. She snapped the scope caps back and looked at him. I know. He held her gaze for 3 seconds. Something moved through his expression. Not quite respect, not yet, but the precursor to it. The acknowledgement that a person had spoken with knowledge rather than performance. He nodded once and looked away. The crew chief held up one finger. She moved to the ridge alone. That was how Overwatch worked. The spotter and sniper deployed separately from the assault element, establishing their position before the ground team moved. Maya had a 3-kilometer approach through terrain that would have been difficult in daylight. At 0130 hours in the Korvath Mountains, it was a series of decisions made by feel, by the dim green of her nods, by the topographic map she'd memorized until the contour lines were as familiar as her own palm. She moved slowly. Speed was the enemy of quiet, and quiet was everything. The ridge reached her before she expected it, a shelf of granite that extended out over the valley at exactly the angle the imagery had suggested, sheltered from the dominant wind direction by a natural rock formation to her northeast. She found the position she'd chosen from the maps and pressed herself flat against the stone, waiting. Waiting was a skill. Most people thought of it as the absence of doing something. Operators understood it as something active, a kind of sustained readiness that required as much discipline as movement. She let the cold settle around her, let her breathing slow to something close to hibernation, let her eyes adjust beyond the nadis to the natural light available, starlight only, the cloud cover having thinned slightly in the past hour. Below her, the valley floor was a gray-on-gray geometry of shadows. The compound sat 890 meters distant. She'd measured it twice from the imagery, and she measured it again now with the rangefinder, confirming 892. She set up the M200 on its bipod, got behind the scope. The compound came into focus, and she started counting. 6 guards on the exterior perimeter. 2 at the main gate, 1 on the northeastern corner, 1 walking the western wall, 2 mobile on the southern approach. She noted each one, tracked their patterns, began building the timing map in her head. The rotation Rourke had briefed, 20 minutes. She could see it now, the subtle synchronization in how the mobile guards moved. Someone had trained these people. The patterns were too consistent for militia. She clocked 3 rotations to confirm, watching the second hand on her dive watch. 19 minutes, 42 seconds. Consistent within 8 seconds across all 3 observations. Disciplined. She keyed her radio. Talon actual. Iron Wolf is set. I have eyes on the compound. 6 exterior. Patterns consistent with briefed intel. 1 addition. There's a guard position on the southern approach I'm marking as a probable reaction force staging point. Recommend the assault element avoids that vector. Rourke's voice came back immediately. Copy, Iron Wolf. Assault element moves in 14. Hold position and stay off the net unless you have something that changes the picture. Understood. She released the transmit key and went back to the scope. The compound sat below her, lit by 2 floodlights on the northeastern and southwestern corners. There was a building inside the wire that was darker than the others. Fewer windows, different construction, a satellite dish on the roof that spoke of either communications or the kind of electronics that required isolation from casual foot traffic. She marked it in her notebook. Primary. Intel officer would be here. 14 minutes until the assault element moved. She counted guards and breathed. The team moved at 0348. Maya watched them emerge from the northern tree line as 6 small shapes in her scope, dark, disciplined, moving in a staggered column with 10 meters between each element. Halder on point, Breck at his left shoulder, Wolf covering the rear. They moved the way teams that have trained together for a long time move. Without signaling, without visible communication, the group as a single organism. Her finger rested outside the trigger guard. The mobile guard on the southern approach was at the far end of his pattern, 70 meters from where the team was moving. He would turn back in approximately 40 seconds based on her timing data. She tracked him through the scope. 38 seconds. He stopped, lit a cigarette. Don't. He was looking north, not toward the team, toward something on the ridge line, maybe her ridge, maybe something else. His posture had changed. The way a person's posture changes when something registers in their peripheral awareness before the conscious mind has caught up. Maya's breathing went very still. Look away, and light your cigarette. For 6 seconds, the guard stood there looking north. Behind him, the assault team was still moving. Then he looked south again, drew on the cigarette, and resumed his pattern. Maya exhaled. The team reached the compound's north wall at the 4-minute mark, exactly as planned. She watched Breck and another operator move to the entry point, a section of the perimeter fence that imagery had identified as a weak point, a gap where the hardened concrete post had partially separated from the fencing due to ground subsidence. It wasn't advertised. Someone had found it by looking very carefully. The fence section moved, the team slipped through, and for the next 43 seconds, everything went exactly as it was supposed to go. The lights came on all at once. Not the perimeter floodlights. Those were already burning. These were different lights, interior lights in every building, external floods activating along the southern wall, the western wall, the gate. The compound went from the careful darkness of a controlled facility to something that looked like a sports stadium. And with the lights came sound, an alarm, not the kind that screamed, but the kind that was low and rhythmic, a controlled signal, a military alarm that meant execute. Maya's scope was already moving. A door on the north building blew open and 8 fighters came through it fast, fanning left and right, with a discipline that confirmed everything she'd suspected in the briefing. These were not militia. They moved like people who had been waiting for exactly this moment. They had anticipated the breach point. They had prepared their reaction to it. It was a trap. Her radio exploded with traffic. Contact, north building. We have fighters, multiple. Breck, left. Entry team, fall back to the wall. Fall back. Iron Wolf, do you have eyes? Rourke's voice, clipped, controlled, the calm that only exists in people who have been in very bad situations before and found their way out. I need a sit rep. Iron Wolf has eyes. She was already tracking. I see 12, 14 fighters on the compound interior. Your team is pinned at the north wall. Machine gun position has been set up. I'm looking at it now. West corner, sandbag emplacement. Looks pre-positioned. A beat. Rourke, they knew you were coming. This is pre-positioned. A 2-second silence. Confirmed, Rourke said. Assault element. We are in a prepared ambush. Consolidate and hold at the north wall. Iron Wolf, I need that machine gun. 892 meters. The machine gunner was behind a sandbag emplacement, partially defilated from her current angle. She could see the barrel. She could see the left side of the gunner's torso extending beyond the sandbag's coverage. She dialed in the elevation adjustment for the distance, applied 7 MOA of windage from what she'd been reading in the valley all night, and breathed. The reticle settled. She pressed the trigger straight back. The suppressed shot sounded like a heavy door closing. The machine gun stopped. Iron Wolf, splash 1, she said. Machine gun is down. Your team has a window. I'd use it. Then the northern ridge lit up with headlights, and Maya understood that the window she'd just created was going to close in about 90 seconds. Because the vehicles rolling down from the northern approach, she counted 3, then 4, then the shape of something larger behind them, were not part of the compound's guard contingent. They were the reinforcement the ambush had been designed to hold the SEALs in place long enough to reach. Below her, on the valley floor, 6 operators who had walked into a prepared kill zone were now trapped between a compound full of fighters and a reinforced element coming in fast from the north. And 900 meters away, in the dark and the wind, Maya Voss pressed her eye to her scope and began making the kind of calculations that didn't allow for second thoughts. The storm came in from the west without warning. That was the particular cruelty of the Korvath Mountains at this elevation. Weather systems that appeared on no forecast, generated by the interaction of cold air masses with the thermal profiles of the valleys, arriving as a wall of wind and particulate that reduced visibility from hundreds of meters to tens of meters in under 2 minutes. Maya felt it hit the ridge before she saw it in the scope, a 30-knot gust from her 7 o'clock that tried to physically move the rifle and would have if she hadn't been bracing against the rock formation. She keyed the radio. Iron Wolf to Talon. You have a weather event inbound from the west. ETA, your position, 60 seconds. Use it if you can. Copy, Iron Wolf. Rourke's voice had that particular quality it got when he was making decisions faster than he could fully articulate them. Assault element. The storm is your cover. Halder, move your people to the secondary breach. East wall. We're going for the primary building. Rice is in there. We're still 2 minutes from that building, Halder's voice came back. Then you'd better move. The storm hit the valley like something had turned a page. One moment Maya had a clear view of the compound through her scope. The next, she was looking at a brown-gray murk that the floodlights only made worse, creating a luminous wall of suspended grit that defeated both her Naudis and her scope's light-gathering capacity. She pulled back from the scope. This was the problem with weather. It was democratic. It reduced everyone's capability equally, which in theory should have helped the team. In practice, the fighters inside the compound knew the layout. The SEALs didn't. The storm was a neutralizer, and neutralizers benefit the defender. She could hear the radio traffic getting worse. Wolf is hit. It's through and through. He can still move. I've lost visual on the east wall. Contact. 2 fighters inside the wire. They're using the storm. Maya made a decision. She lifted the M200, slung it across her back, and moved off the ridgeline. She was moving into the storm. The ridge descent was 400 meters of loose rock and scrub brush, in conditions that made it actively hostile, the wind pushing her sideways, the particulate finding every gap in her kit, the visibility down to maybe 8 meters and dropping. She moved on memory and the topographic lines she'd ingrained in the briefing, triangulating her position by terrain feel. She reached the valley floor in 11 minutes. The compound's eastern wall was a gray shape in the murk ahead of her. She could hear the firefight before she could see it, the crack and thump of weapons fire, the deeper report of something heavier on the northern approach, a continuous mechanical grinding that she identified as the armored vehicles working down the valley road. She moved along the wall toward the sounds and found Halder with 4 operators behind a vehicle that had been turned on its side, using it as cover. Halder looked at her like she'd materialized from the storm itself. What are you doing on the valley floor? Ridgeline was useless in this visibility, she said. I need a different angle. What's your situation? 2 wounded. Wolf's mobile, Carson's not. Breck is inside the wire with Rice. They found him in the primary building, but they can't move him without covering fire. And there's an armored vehicle on the north road. I saw it from the ridge. BRDM2 looks like. Thermal optics. Halder's expression told her he knew what that meant. Thermal meant the storm gave them no cover. The vehicle could track body heat through the particulate. If it rolled down into the valley floor, the team was visible regardless of what the weather did. My rifle won't touch that armor, she said. What anti-armor assets do you have? We came light. M3 MAAWs was supposed to be on the bird, but there was a loadout error. Halder's voice was even, but his jaw was very tight. We are looking at a prepared ambush with anti-armor support, and we came in without anti-armor. Maya looked north through the murk. She could see the vehicle's lights, just the lights barely, a pair of yellow-white smears in the brown air. Then she looked east, toward where the assault element's helicopter had been planned to insert, toward the section of the valley floor she'd studied on the imagery. There had been a destroyed vehicle in the imagery. Old, a previous engagement, maybe 2 months old from the vegetation growth pattern she'd seen on it. She'd noted it as a terrain feature and moved on. She thought about it now. There's a destroyed vehicle approximately 200 meters east, she said. What was in this valley 2 months ago? Halder looked at her. An engagement, one of ours, hit an IED on the road. Why? Because if it was a vehicle carrying anti-armor equipment, the material would have been cleared by now. Would it? She looked at him. In a storm at this elevation, would anyone have gone out to clear it at night? Halder's eyes moved to the east. He was doing the same calculation she was doing. He didn't like where it went. She could see that. He liked it less than the alternative. Iron Wolf, he said. Yeah, that vehicle is 200 meters through an active fire zone. I know. If it's been cleared, then I come back and we think of something else. She checked the Glock on her thigh and looked at him. Get Breck on the radio. Tell him to hold inside the wire for 6 minutes. Can he do that? Halder keyed his radio without looking away from her. Breck, how long can you hold your position? Static. Then Breck's voice, clipped and very focused. I can give you 5. After that, the fighters inside this building are going to figure out we're here. We're down to suppressive only. I'm watching ammo. 6 minutes, Halder said to Maya. 5 is fine, she said, and moved into the storm. 200 meters through an active engagement was not the 200 meters of a track or a road. It was the 200 meters of a valley floor in a dust storm, with fighters moving in and out of visibility on her left, with the BRDM grinding its way slowly down the north road on her right, with weapons fire cutting through the particulate at irregular intervals like something random and mechanical and indifferent. She moved low and fast, using the vehicle debris and loose rock for cover, pausing whenever the ambient noise changed in ways that suggested someone was close. Twice she heard voices. Dari, she thought, or something close to it, and pressed flat and waited while the shapes moved past her in the murk. The destroyed vehicle appeared as a dark mass in the grit. She reached it in 4 minutes and 40 seconds. It was an MRAP, or had been. The hull had been thrown open by an IED blast from below, the undercarriage destroyed, but the rear cargo section was mostly intact, tilted at an angle with the rear access panel partially open. She squeezed through the gap and into the cargo space. It smelled of burned metal and something older. She clicked on a red lens light and swept the interior. The cargo racks had been cleared, mostly. On the floor, wedged under the collapsed lower rack and partially buried under debris from the blast, was a case. Green, military. She could read the stencil even under the dirt. M136AT4, single-shot anti-armor. 84 millimeters. Designed for exactly the class of armored vehicle that was currently rolling down the valley toward 6 people who were running out of options. She pulled the case clear and opened it. The weapon was intact. She was back through the gap and moving before she'd made a conscious decision to go. 3 minutes, 30 seconds until Breck's window closed. The BRDM was still on the northern road, but it was moving. She could track it by sound, the engine note changing as it descended toward the valley floor. She needed an angle. Not from where Halder was. Too close to the team, backblast would be a problem in that confined space. She needed open ground behind her and a firing line to the vehicle that didn't have operators in the probable backblast zone. She found a position behind a rock formation 40 meters from the valley road, off-axis from the team's position, with 8 meters of clear ground behind her. The BRDM came through the murk like something emerging from deep water. First its lights, then the low dark shape of its hull, then the distinctive angular silhouette of the turret tracking left to right in a thermal search pattern. It was 30 meters out when she put the AT-4 on her shoulder. She gave herself one breath. She pressed the safety and the arming mechanism in the sequence she'd been taught 8 years ago in a training environment that had felt completely theoretical at the time. The BRDM's turret was moving right. In 2 seconds, it would complete its sweep and move left, and on the left side it would find the heat signatures of 6 operators who had no place left to go. Maya put the sight picture on the center of the hull, halfway between the front wheel station and the turret ring, and fired. The backblast erased the world behind her for a fraction of a second. The round covered 30 meters in approximately 1/15 of a second. The BRDM did not survive the geometry of that transaction. The fireball went up into the brown murk of the storm and lit the valley floor in orange and red, and in that brief, violent illumination, Maya could see the compound's east wall and Halder's position, and the fighters who had been advancing through the storm all stopping at once and turning toward the fire. She dropped the empty launcher. Her radio crackled. Breck's voice, and it was the voice of someone who has just heard something they cannot explain and cannot ignore. Iron Wolf, was that... Did you just... Clear, she said. Move your package. Now. She was already moving toward the east wall. Above her, in the murk, the fire from the burning BRDM continued to climb. And for approximately 4 seconds, the valley was fully illuminated. In that light, the fighter she hadn't seen, the one who'd been 10 meters to her left in the storm, motionless, watching, raised his weapon. She heard the shot before she understood it had been fired. The impact hit her left shoulder and spun her into the ground. The cold of the rock came up to meet her face, and she lay there for a moment with the sound of the fire above her and the storm around her, and she thought, "Get up, get up. You have 5 minutes until extraction and 6 people who need you to get up." She got up. The shoulder was wrong. She could feel that without looking at it. The particular wrongness of disrupted tissue, the arm responding with a half-second delay, the pain arriving on its own schedule, bright and methodical. She drew the Glock with her right hand, and she walked toward the east wall. The east wall came out of the murk as a concrete smear against the brown air, and Maya walked toward it with her right hand on the Glock and her left arm doing something that was not quite working correctly. The shoulder wasn't bleeding badly, or if it was, the cold had narrowed the vessels enough that she couldn't feel the full extent of it yet. What she could feel was the mechanical failure, deltoid compromised, the arm hanging at an angle that required conscious correction every few seconds, the fingers responding when she told them to, but with that quarter-second lag that meant the signal was traveling through damaged tissue before it arrived anywhere useful. She cataloged this the way her instructors had taught her, not as a crisis, but as a constraint. You work with what you have. You don't mourn the rest. The gate in the east wall had been breached. She could see the frame bent outward, the hinges sheared, the marks of a mechanical entry tool. Breck's work. She stepped through the gap and into the compound's interior. The storm was slightly less savage inside the walls, the structures breaking the dominant wind direction and creating a microclimate of relative calm. The particulate still hung in the air, but the visibility had improved. She could see maybe 20 meters in most directions. The secondary building was directly ahead. The sounds of fighting had moved. She found Breck coming around the corner of the primary building with a man she didn't recognize, slight build, disoriented movement, civilian clothes under a gray blanket, zip-tied wrists that Breck was in the process of cutting. Rice. The DIA officer. Rice looked like 11 days of captivity looked. His face had the particular vacancy of someone running on a combination of adrenaline and shock, the kind of expression that wasn't processing everything in real time so much as recording it for later. He was moving, which was the important thing. Breck saw Maya, and his face did something complicated. She'd seen that expression before. That specific recalibration when a person's existing model of someone turns out to be insufficient. He looked at the shoulder, then at the empty AT-4 sling that she'd ditched, then at her face. "How bad?" he said. "I can move." She holstered the Glock and took Rice's other arm. "What's the extraction status?" Rourke called the bird, 22 minutes to the LZ. Breck was moving them back toward the east wall breach. "We need to get Halder and the others." "Carson?" "Wolf's carrying him. Carson took one in the upper leg. It's a bleeder, but Wolf's got a tourniquet on it." A pause. "We lost Petrov." She hadn't known Petrov well. He'd been quiet in the briefing room, hadn't said anything about her placement, one way or another. She put his name somewhere inside herself and kept moving. The east wall breach opened onto the valley floor, and the continuing orange light of the burning BRDM, which had begun to produce a secondary fire from its fuel tank that cast the nearest 50 meters of valley in unsteady amber. Halder was there with the remaining operators, consolidated. Wolf, with Carson's arm over his shoulder, everyone moving toward the northern extraction route. Halder looked at Maya the same way Breck had. Then he looked at the shoulder. "Can you move?" he said. "You're the second person who's asked me that in 3 minutes. Because the answer matters. We have approximately 18 minutes to cover 900 meters of valley floor in a dust storm with 2 casualties and 1 HVT. Then we should stop talking about my shoulder," she said. Halder's mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile. He turned and moved. The extraction was not clean. Extraction is never clean when things have gone sideways. Clean extractions exist in planning documents and after-action reports sanitized for brevity. What the Corvath Valley floor gave them instead was 900 meters of stumbling, controlled aggression movement through thinning storm and intermittent contact, with Halder managing the route and Maya managing the rear. She'd taken a position at the back of the element because it made tactical sense, and because her shoulder made everything with 2 hands difficult, and the rear position in a moving element required mostly observation, communication, and the ability to fire a pistol with one hand if it came to that. She could do all three. The fighters from the compound were in pursuit, but disorganized. The destruction of the BRDM and the death of the machine gunner had disrupted their command coordination. She'd been watching for that in the initial minutes, and it was playing out the way she'd expected. Prepared ambushes rely on their anchor points. Remove the anchor points, and what you have left is a group of individually capable people without a shared operational picture. They were still dangerous. They were just no longer a coherent threat. She fired the Glock twice during the 900-meter movement. Both times at shapes emerging from the murk at ranges under 30 meters. Both times at lateral threats that would have reached the element's flank before Halder could have redirected to address them. She didn't call out the shots. She didn't need to. Halder heard them and adjusted his pace, trusting the rear was handled. That trust cost him nothing. She put it in the same internal register as Petrov's name, things to carry, things that mattered. The LZ was a flat section of valley floor that the imagery had identified as the only space within the extraction radius capable of accommodating the Blackhawk's rotor clearance in these terrain conditions. It was marked by an IR strobe that Halder activated at the 900-meter mark, and it was empty when they reached it, which was the correct thing for an LZ to be. Rourke was there. She hadn't known where he'd been during the engagement, command element, likely, positioned somewhere she didn't have visibility on, managing the air assets and the command net while Halder ran the ground picture. He was standing at the edge of the LZ with a radio handset and an expression that had been through several versions of itself in the past 2 hours. He looked at Maya's shoulder before he said anything else. "That needs a medic." "In 20 minutes," she said. He held her gaze for a moment, then he turned to Breck. "Asset status?" "Ambulatory, disoriented, probably dehydrated." "He's coherent." He was asking questions the whole way. Rice was sitting on the ground nearby with his back against a rock, the gray blanket still around his shoulders. He was looking at his own hands with the particular focus of someone who is trying to determine if they are still real. He was not okay. He would be okay eventually, but he was not okay right now. The Black Hawk came in at 0511 hours, 17 minutes after Halder activated the strobe, and it came in fast and flat and without hesitation, the crew having clearly been briefed on the situation on the ground. The rotor wash hit the remaining particulate and turned the LZ into a temporary whiteout that everyone simply endured with their eyes closed and their weight leaning forward. Carson went on first. Wolf went with him. Reese was guided on by Breck. Maya was moving toward the ramp when Rourke put his hand briefly on her good shoulder. Not blocking, just contact, the brief physical acknowledgement that words hadn't arrived at yet. She got on the helicopter. They flew for 40 minutes before the medic, a compact Peruvian-American PJ named Sandoval, got her gear off and looked at the shoulder in the helicopter's red interior light. "Through and through," Sandoval said, which she'd already assumed. "You've got tissue damage and the deltoid is partially torn. Nothing severed that I can see, but this needs imaging when we land." "I know." "You feel that?" He pressed 2 fingers against the lateral aspect of the shoulder. "Yes." "Good. That's good." He was packing gauze into the entry wound with efficient, ungentle movements. "How long were you moving on this?" She thought about it. The AT-4 shot, the fighter in the storm, the walk to the east wall. 900 meters of valley floor, 17 minutes waiting at the LZ. "Approximately 40 minutes. Sandoval looked at her. Not with admiration, she noticed, with the particular expression of a medical professional who is calculating what that means for tissue damage and infection risk. "That was not smart," he said. "No," she agreed. Across the helicopter's interior, in the red half-light, she could see Breck watching her. He looked away when she noticed. Then he looked back, and when she didn't look away, he held it. He gave her a slow nod. 1 degree of inclination, maybe 2. The kind of acknowledgement that doesn't have a verbal form because whatever would be said would be insufficient. She looked at the ceiling and let Sandoval work. Red Talon FOB at 0620 hours looked exactly as it always did, because forward operating bases exist outside the emotional weather of the operations they support. The motor pool was the motor pool. The comms tent was the comms tent. The particular smell of jet fuel and field kitchen and machine oil that constituted the base's atmospheric identity was unchanged and unchanging. What was different was the people. She noticed it first at the tarmac when they offloaded, the ground crew and the handful of operators and support personnel who were there for the arrival. There was a quality to the attention that she hadn't encountered before, not the silence of the briefing room, which had been the silence of doubt. This was a different category. This was the silence of people revising their understanding of something they thought they'd already understood. She was moving through it on Sandoval's arm. He'd insisted on the escort to the medical facility, citing liability in a tone that was professional, but also slightly worried about her. When she passed Petty Officer Watts, who had been in the briefing room and who had been one of the ones she'd clocked as part of Breck's ambient audience. Watts said nothing. But he stepped aside and moved his eyes to the ground, and there was something in the movement that was not exactly a gesture of respect. It was too involuntary for that, too reflexive, but it was the precursor to one. The physical acknowledgement that a category error had been made. Maya moved past him without acknowledgement. She was too tired for the meaning of it to land properly, and her shoulder was arguing loudly for the first time now that the adrenaline was metabolizing, and she was thinking about Petrov, whose absence had a shape that would take time to fully understand. The medical facility was a hardened GP medium tent with actual lighting and an actual field surgery setup, which Red Talon ran because the nature of their operations made medical capability a permanent necessity rather than an occasional need. The doctor on duty was a major named Ferris, who had clearly been briefed by radio on the incoming casualties. He had Carson already on a table, the tourniquet being managed, and he pointed Sandoval toward the secondary bay without looking up from what he was doing. Maya sat on the edge of the examination table and looked at the opposite wall while Ferris worked through Carson's situation and left her to Sandoval and a PFC medic who introduced himself as Torres and seemed about 22 years old and earnest in a way that was either going to be trained out of him or was going to make him exceptional. "Can I ask you something?" Torres said. He was cutting away the sleeve of her base layer. "Go ahead." "When you fired the AT-4, how did you know the clearance was enough? Like the backblast zone in that confined, I measured it." "In the middle of a firefight? You measure it or you don't fire it." She looked at him. "That's not a complicated rule." Torres absorbed this. He was applying irrigation to the wound, which was not a pleasant experience, and she was aware of the sounds she wasn't making during it. "You trained as a sniper?" he said. "Yes." "But you knew anti-armor systems." "I knew a lot of systems. You learn what you need to learn." A pause. "Don't stop irrigating because you're asking questions." Torres resumed. "Where'd you learn that? The AT-4 application in confined." "Mogadishu," she said, and then stopped, because that was further than she'd intended to go. Torres looked at her. Sandoval, who was preparing suturing materials at the adjacent counter, had gone very still in the way that people go still when they're suddenly paying attention without wanting to appear to be paying attention. "I thought you said one deployment," Torres said. His voice was careful now, navigating something he could feel but not see. "I did." "Mogadishu isn't—" "It wasn't a deployment," Maya said. "It was a training attachment, 18 months ago, before I came here." She looked at the wall. "The unit I was attached to was involved in an engagement during a training exercise that stopped being a training exercise." The silence that followed had a specific texture. Sandoval was the one who filled it, not with words, but by resuming his work with the deliberate neutrality of a professional who has learned when to let things be. Torres did not ask another question. Work found her at 0845 in the small common area adjacent to the medical bay, sitting in one of the 4 folding chairs with her arm in a sling and a cup of coffee that had gone cold 30 minutes ago and that she was still holding because it gave her hand something to do. He sat down in the chair across from her. He had coffee too, a travel mug, dented, the kind of object that had been everywhere with him for a long time. He looked like a man who had written 3 reports and made 6 phone calls in the past 2 hours and was still running the numbers on something. "How's the shoulder?" he said. "Ferris says 6 to 8 weeks before full range of motion. He's not pleased with me. No. Rourke drank his coffee. Carson's going to be fine. The leg was significant, but Wolf's tourniquet was perfect application. Another 4 minutes and we'd be having a different conversation. She nodded. Petrov. He said the name and let it sit. Yes. He had a daughter, 8 months old. Rourke was not looking at her, was looking at some middle distance that the tent wall provided a surface for. He'd been carrying a photo. I saw it in the briefing room. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. She put Petrov's name in the place where she kept the things she would carry for a long time and pressed it in. Rourke put his mug down on the floor beside the chair and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, which was the posture he adopted when he was about to say something he'd worked out carefully in advance. The after-action is going to generate some questions, he said, specifically about the AT-4 employment. The material recovery from a destroyed asset it's irregular. There are procedures for accounting for that kind of equipment, and recovering it unilaterally in an active engagement zone and firing it without authorization from the command element is— I know what it is, Maya said. I'm not building a case against you. He looked at her directly. I'm telling you that there will be questions and that I intend to answer them in a specific way, and I wanted you to know that before the paperwork arrives. She looked at him. What way? The way that reflects what actually happened. He picked his mug back up, which is that an operator identified a threat that exceeded the team's current organic assets, recovered available material, and engaged within the rules of engagement to protect the element, which is accurate. It's also the best possible interpretation. Yes, he didn't flinch from that. That's how I'm writing it. She was quiet for a moment. There's something you should probably know about Mogadishu. I know about Mogadishu, Rourke said. She looked at him. He met her eyes. How long, she said. Before I requested you for this team. He considered it. About 3 weeks. Your file doesn't say Somalia. It says training attachment, exactly the way you described it to the medic. But the unit you were attached to filed a combat action report for that engagement, and I know how to read a combat action report. He paused. You were not in a supporting role in that engagement. She said nothing. You were the reason 6 people got out of a building in Mogadishu that they should not have gotten out of. He stood up. Which is approximately the same outcome as tonight. So I'm going to suggest that the pattern here is not a coincidence. He picked up the cold mug from the floor and walked to the coffee station and poured what was in it into the drain and refilled it. Get some sleep, he said, not turning around. The debrief is at 1400. I need you coherent. He walked out. Maya sat with the cold coffee and the sound of the FOB waking up around her and thought about the Mogadishu building, which she hadn't thought about in any sustained way in 18 months, and which the shoulder pain was now making feel recent. She did not sleep. She went to the armory instead because the M200 was there and it needed cleaning. And cleaning a weapon was a thing her hands knew how to do without her brain's active participation, which meant her brain was free to do other things. She broke the weapon down and laid the components on the bench in the order she'd been doing it since she was 16 years old. And her father had first handed her a precision rifle and told her that accuracy was not a gift but a conversation between a shooter and a weapon, and that the conversation required both parties to be prepared. Her father had not been a soldier. He'd been a machinist in Billings, Montana, who had shot long-range competitions on weekends, and who had understood intuitively that the discipline required for precision shooting was the same discipline required for everything else that mattered: the sustained attention, the patience with failure, the willingness to sit with bad data and keep working until the answer was correct. She ran the bore brush through the barrel in slow, even strokes. She heard footsteps behind her and knew from the weight of them that it was Halder before he spoke. You clean it even when it hasn't been fired, he said. It was fired. You know what I mean. He came to stand at the end of the bench, not beside her, giving her the space she was obviously occupying. He looked at the components laid out with the particular respect that operators hold for other operators' gear. Ferris cleared you for light duty. He cleared me for the debrief. Same thing at this FOB. Halder put his hands in his pockets. Breck wants to talk to you. She ran the brush again. He knows where I am. He's not good at the first move. It's a character defect. A pause. He means well. I know he does. That doesn't make it easier for him. She set the brush down and picked up a cleaning patch. What does he want to say? I don't know exactly, but I know what I want to say, so maybe start with that and assume his version is similar. Halder was quiet for a moment. The armory around them was empty. It was 0900, and the morning shift was in the motor pool. What you did last night, the ridgeline work, the valley floor, the AT4, there's not a training program that produces that. That's something else. Training programs produced most of it. You know what I mean. She did. She kept cleaning. I misjudged you, Halder said. It came out flat and even, the way a man who does not apologize easily makes an apology. No performance to it, no vocal softening, just the statement. Based on what I saw in the briefing room and what I knew from your file, I made a judgment that was incorrect. I want you to know that I know it was incorrect. She looked at him. His face was the same face it always was, weathered, controlled, not given to readable expressions. But the eyes were doing something different. They were doing the work that the face wasn't. Master Chief, she said. Yeah. You asked the right questions in the helicopter. You positioned your team correctly throughout the engagement. You made the right calls under bad information in a compromised situation. She set the cleaning patch down. Your judgment was fine where it needed to count. Halder held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then something in his face shifted, very slightly, and he nodded once, that same minimal degree of acknowledgement that Breck had given her on the helicopter. He walked out without saying anything else. She put the cleaning patch in the discard box and picked up the next one. The bore was still carrying particulate from the valley. She worked it out slowly, methodically, the way her father had shown her, not forcing anything, letting the process do what the process was designed to do. She was on the 4th patch when Breck came through the armory door. He stood there for a moment, looking at the bench the way Halder had, and then he came to stand beside her. Not at the end of the bench, but beside her, which was a different thing. He was quiet for long enough that it stopped being awkward and became something else. She kept working. Finally he said, "The machine gun emplacement." "Yes." That was 900 meters, partial target. He was looking at the barrel, not at her. I've seen 3 snipers who I considered exceptional in 12 years of doing this. The best of them would have taken 3 shots at that target. She didn't respond. "You took 1, he said. She set down the patch. She looked at him. Breck was not a man who found vulnerability comfortable. She could see that in the set of his shoulders, the way he was looking at the barrel instead of at her, the fact that he'd put Halder in the position of announcing him rather than simply walking in. He was doing something difficult, and he knew it was difficult, and he was doing it anyway, which she respected. "I had good data," she said. "I'd been reading the wind for 4 hours. I knew the distance. I knew the target's position." She picked up the barrel. "The shot wasn't exceptional. It was prepared." "That's not how it looked from the north wall." "I know." He was quiet again. She resumed the cleaning. "I should have," he started. "Don't," she said. Not harshly, just flat. "You were doing your job, covering your team, asking hard questions about the person covering your back from 900 meters. She looked at him. "That's the job. I don't want an apology for someone doing the job." Breck looked at her for a long moment. His jaw moved. Then he looked at the bench. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. He stood there for another few seconds, and she got the impression that there was more he'd come in to say, and that the more was not finding its way out right now, which was fine. There was time. They were both still here, which was the relevant fact. He walked toward the door. At the threshold, he stopped. "You said Mogadishu, but," he said, not turning around. "Torres told me." She kept working. "I was in MOG 18 months ago," he said. "Different unit, different sector. But there was a report that went around, it's a building on the east side, 6 contractors, a situation that shouldn't have resolved the way it did." He paused. "I always wondered about that report." She said nothing. Breck stood in the doorway for a moment longer. Then he walked out. She held the barrel in both hands, the bad shoulder complaining, the good shoulder doing most of the work. and looked at the clean bore and the morning light coming through the armory's single window. The debrief was in 5 hours. She had work to do. The dust storm had cleared by 1100. The Korvath Mountains, visible for the first time since before the operation from the FOB's perimeter, sat against a sky that had gone very blue and very cold, the peaks catching light at angles that made them look like something painted rather than real. She stood outside the medical bay with the sling on and looked at them for a while. Somewhere inside those mountains, in the compound that was now dark and presumably evacuated by whatever fighters had survived the engagement, there was evidence of preparation that the intelligence community was going to want to understand, how the ambush had been set, who had planned it, who had known the SEAL team was coming, and how far in advance they had known. Rourke had said the debrief was at 1400. She understood that the debrief was not just about the mission. It was about the intelligence failure that had turned the mission into an ambush. It was about the source who had compromised the operational security. It was about the question nobody had asked in the briefing room, which was the question she'd been asking herself since the floodlights came on. They knew we were coming. The mountains held their blue cold light and said nothing. She went back inside. The debrief room was smaller than the briefing room and less formally arranged. A folding table, 8 chairs, a laptop connected to a wall-mounted screen that was displaying the satellite imagery of the compound alongside a timeline someone had built during the morning. Rourke was already seated when Maya came in at 1358. Halder was there. Breck, an intelligence officer she hadn't met named Calloway, mid-30s, civilian clothes that were trying to look like they weren't civilian clothes, the particular energy of someone who processes information for a living and has strong feelings about it. There was a woman from the Signals Intelligence section whose name Maya hadn't caught, and a JAG officer who was there to observe and who had the expression of someone who knew he was in a room where the real conversation was going to happen around him rather than through him. Rice was not there. Rice was in the medical facility, sedated, which Ferris had decided was necessary after the DIA officer had attempted to leave the base at 0800 and had been found at the perimeter wire in his civilian clothes, still carrying the gray blanket, apparently unaware of where he was trying to go. Maya sat down. Her shoulder throbbed under the sling with a rhythm that was almost metronomic. She'd taken nothing for the pain because she needed to think clearly, and the threshold for that calculation had been crossed sometime around 300 and had not been revisited. Calloway opened a folder without looking up. I'm going to lead with the operational intelligence failure, because that's the part of last night that has the longest tail. He had a flat Midwestern accent and spoke the way people who spend their careers in classified environments speak, with the particular precision of someone who has learned that every word has a weight and an addressee. The compound at grid reference 279er was flagged as a probable detention site 14 days ago based on signals collection and a single human source. The source provided the compound layout, the guard rotation timing, and the designation of Captain Rice as the primary asset being held. All of that information was accurate. He looked up. The source also provided, apparently, the timing and composition of our rescue element to the compound's defensive commander. Nobody said anything. We have a penetrated source network, Calloway said in the tone of someone confirming weather. The intelligence that got Rice captured came from the same network. We assessed the source as reliable. We were wrong. Rourke's voice was careful. How far does the penetration go? We don't know yet. That's the medium-term problem. Calloway closed the folder. The immediate problem is that Captain Rice, before he was sedated, managed to communicate approximately 40 seconds of information to one of Ferris's nurses that we believe is relevant. He pulled a single printed sheet from underneath the folder and placed it on the table. He said the name Victor Draven. The signals officer looked up. Halder's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. Maya watched Calloway's face. Who is Victor Draven? She said. The correct question, Calloway said, looking at her, is who was Victor Draven? 11 years ago, he was a GRU field officer working under a commercial cover in Central Asia. He ran assets in 3 countries simultaneously, which is unusual. 5 years ago, he dropped off the collection picture entirely, which is sometimes what happens when a GRU officer goes native, and sometimes what happens when a GRU officer goes somewhere that our collection picture doesn't reach. He put one finger on the printed sheet. What Rice told the nurse is that the man who is running the compound is the same man whose operational methods he recognized from 3 previous DIA cases spanning 9 years. He said, and this is a direct quote, "It's Draven. Tell them it's Draven. He's been here the whole time." The room processed this for a moment. "He's been in the Korvath sector," Halder said. Not a question. "That appears to be what Rice was communicating, yes." Calloway picked up the sheet and put it back under the folder with the deliberate movement of someone who wants it out of sight. Which means the compound was not a local operation with penetrated intelligence. It was a directed operation, run by someone with the experience and the resources to identify and compromise our source network, and then use our rescue attempt as an additional intelligence collection event. He looked around the table. They wanted to see how we'd respond. The ambush was partly tactical and partly an assessment. An assessment of what? Breck said. Of our methods. Our team composition. Our response to a compromised extraction. Calloway looked at his folder. Of who shows up when we think we can recover a DIA asset quietly. The room was very still. Maya was looking at the satellite imagery on the wall screen, the compound, the ridgeline where she'd been positioned, the valley floor. She was overlaying the night on the image in her memory. The timing of the alarm, the pre-positioned machine gun emplacement, the armored vehicle on the north road that had been positioned before the engagement began. The BRDM was pre-staged, she said. Calloway looked at her. It wasn't a reaction force, she said. It was already in position when we arrived. The staging point was the north road, and it moved on a timer or a signal, not in response to what was happening in the compound. She looked at Rourke. Someone coordinated that from outside the compound. Someone with a view of the whole engagement who was making decisions about when to deploy each asset. Rourke was looking at the imagery. The ambush had a conductor, Maya said. The word landed in the room, and nobody refuted it. The debrief ran for 2 hours and 40 minutes and produced, as far as Maya could see, more questions than it resolved. What it did resolve. The rescue of Captain Rice, the destruction of an armored asset, the confirmed elimination of 9 fighters from the compound's defensive element, and the recovery of signals intelligence from the compound's communications equipment that Calloway's section was currently working through. These were the things that went in the positive column. What it did not resolve. The identity and current location of Victor Draven, the full extent of the source network penetration, and the question of what Draven had actually learned from the previous night's operation. What the debrief opened up in the last 20 minutes was a new operational question. Calloway put a second satellite image on the screen. A different location. Further south, wider valley, different terrain signature. 41 hours ago, signals collection picked up a transmission pattern consistent with command-level communications from this location. We've been running pattern analysis on it since last night, and it correlates with the command transmissions we intercepted from the compound engagement. He looked at the room. If Draven was conducting the compound ambush from a forward position, there is a high probability that this is where he went afterward. Probability, Rourke said, 62%. That's not high. No. Calloway didn't apologize for the number. It's the best we have. Rourke looked at the image for a long moment. Then he looked at Halder. What's your team's operational status? Halder did the inventory out loud. Carson is non-deployable, minimum 3 weeks. Wolf is light duty, probably 5 days before he's field ready. Petrov is... He stopped. 5-person element, 2 of them below full capacity. Iron Wolf, Rourke said. She looked at him. Your shoulder is a limitation, she said, not a disqualifier. Ferris would disagree. Ferris is not an operator. Rourke looked at her with the expression of a man who has already made a decision and is considering how much of the reasoning behind it to share. The signal's intercept is degrading. The window on that location is narrow. If Draven was there and he's moving, we have maybe 36 hours before the pattern disappears. Then we should stop discussing my shoulder, she said, using the same words she'd used with Halder on the valley floor. Something moved through Rourke's expression, recognition, maybe, of the echo. He looked at the image on the screen. 62%, he said, more to himself than to the room. Victor Draven, Calloway said, compromised a source network, directed an operation that killed one of your operators and captured a DIA intelligence officer, and has been running unseen in this sector for an unknown period of time. He closed the laptop. 62% looks different when you factor in the alternative. The room held the weight of that. 1400 hours tomorrow, Rourke said. New mission brief. Rest, refit, and I want Rice's full debrief the moment Ferris clears him. He stood, dismissed. She slept for 6 hours and woke at 2200 with the shoulder complaining and the particular disorientation of someone whose internal clock has been rendered meaningless by the events of the previous 24 hours. The FOB was quiet. The night shift had the watch, and the base had the particular subdued quality of an installation that is neither fully asleep nor fully awake. She sat on the edge of her bunk and worked through the range of motion exercises that Sandoval had given her, gentle, deliberate, aimed at keeping the tissue from stiffening rather than at recovery, which was a longer project. She was on the third repetition when she heard the knock on the frame of her quarters. A converted shipping container that she had to herself, which was the advantage of being attached rather than assigned. "Come in," she said. It was Rice. He was wearing scrubs from the medical facility and boots that were untied, and he looked substantially more coherent than he had at the LZ, which wasn't a high bar but was something. His face had the quality of someone who has slept and eaten and rehydrated and has arrived on the other side of the immediate crisis, to find the full weight of it waiting. He was holding a mug. He looked at her shoulder. "I can come back," he said. "You are already here." She gestured at the single chair. "Sit." He sat. He held the mug with both hands and looked at the floor. "I know who you are," he said. "From the mission report they let me read this afternoon. Lieutenant Maya Voss, assigned to Overwatch." He looked up. "You fired the AT-4. "Yes." "Ferris's nurse told me you walked 400 meters through an active engagement zone to recover an anti-armor weapon from a destroyed vehicle." He paused. "After you'd already been shot." She said nothing. "I want to understand something," Rice said. "And you don't have to answer, but I've been in that compound for 11 days, and there are things I need to understand before I can—" He stopped. "Why did you go into the valley? You were on the ridge. That was your position. Nobody told you to leave it." She looked at him. He was genuinely asking, not challenging, not performing. The question had the quality of something important to him. "The ridgeline became ineffective," she said. "The storm closed it. My team was in contact on the valley floor and the threat exceeded their organic assets. The calculation was straightforward." "The calculation," he said. "Yes." Rice looked at his mug. "Victor Draven told me during one of the interrogation sessions that the rescue attempt would fail. Not as a taunt. He said it like a briefing, like he was reading from a report." He looked up. He said, "The team they send will be capable, but the asset they deploy to Overwatch will be the limiting factor." Those were his exact words. The room was quiet. "He expected the sniper to be the weak point," Rice said. Maya looked at the wall. Somewhere in the information that had built Victor Draven's assessment of their team, there had been a detail that had told him who was on Overwatch, which meant the source penetration included their team composition, which meant Draven had known not just that a rescue was coming, but who was coming, and he had made a prediction about her specifically. She thought about that. "He was wrong," Rice said quietly. "He was working with incomplete information," she said. Rice looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, the nod of someone filing something away. He stood, took his mug, and moved to the door. "Thank you," he said, "for the thing you don't accept thanks for." She didn't answer. He walked out. She sat on the bunk and looked at her hands in the quiet and thought about Victor Draven, who had studied her and made a prediction and been wrong. And she thought about the second location on Calloway's satellite image and the 36-hour window, and what it meant that Draven was still in the sector. The mission brief at 1400 the next day moved faster than the first one. Rourke put the second satellite image on the screen and walked the room through the signal's intelligence, the probability assessment, and the operational concept in 11 minutes. The concept was straightforward. A four-person element, reduced footprint, no helicopter insertion, ground approach from the south, which added 6 kilometers but avoided the ridgelines where the previous night's engagement had made aerial insertion tactically conspicuous. The team: Halder, Breck, a fourth operator named Garza who had been on FOB support during the first mission and who had a quiet, contained competence that Maya had clocked during the morning refit, and Maya. 4 people. 1 objective: confirm or deny the presence of Victor Draven at the second location. Not a capture mission, an intelligence mission with the understanding that intelligence missions sometimes became other things. Questions, Rourke said. Breck raised his hand. ROE. Same as the first mission, with an addition. Rourke looked at the room. Victor Draven, if identified, is a capture priority. Command wants him alive and talking. If capture is not possible, he left the rest of the sentence in the air where it belonged. Identification protocol, Maya said. What confirmation threshold? Calloway, who was seated against the wall, spoke. Rice has provided a physical description and 3 identifying characteristics, including a specific scar pattern on the left forearm from a grenade fragmentation incident in 2009. Visual confirmation of 2 of the 3 identifiers is the threshold. At what range? She said. Calloway looked at her. He understood the question. Close range would be preferable. Well, close range and capture require significant team exposure in an unknown facility. She kept her voice even. If I'm on Overwatch and can confirm 2 identifiers at distance, you get your confirmation without putting the capture element at risk before we know what we're walking into. The room was quiet. Rourke looked at her. Can you make that confirmation at range? Depends on the range and the lighting conditions. What's the facility layout? Calloway brought up the imagery. A smaller structure than the compound, single building, partial exterior, an open area on the south side that functioned as what appeared to be a vehicle staging area. Several outbuildings. The kind of installation that existed in various forms throughout the mountains, agricultural in origin, adapted for other uses. Maya studied it. The open vehicle area was exposed. If Draven moved through that area, a position on the southern approach at 400 meters would give her a view of the left forearm. She'd need him stationary for 3 to 4 seconds. 400 meters, she said. If he moves through the vehicle area. If he doesn't, we need the capture element to create a situation that draws him outside. Breck looked at her. You want to use us as bait. I want to use a controlled exposure as a trigger. She looked at him. There's a difference. The difference is interesting to discuss from 400 meters away. Then we discuss it in a way that keeps you at minimum exposure. She looked at Rourke. I need to see the latest imagery of that open area and the southern approach terrain. Can Calloway's section get me updated collection in the next 2 hours? They can, Rourke said. He looked at Calloway. Calloway nodded. Then I can give you a plan by 1900, she said. The room adjusted to this. The subtle shift that happens when someone who was recently a subject of doubt takes the chair at the center of the room's attention without asking for it. Halder was watching her from across the table. His expression was what it always was. But he'd stopped crossing his arms, she noticed. At some point in the past 14 hours, the arms had uncrossed, and he hadn't noticed or hadn't bothered to correct it. Breck was looking at the imagery. Garza, who had been quiet throughout, was looking at her with the evaluative attention of someone encountering a new variable and trying to determine where it fits. 1900, Rourke said. Confirmed. The updated imagery arrived at 1710, and Calloway's section had done good work. Multiple collection angles, a ground truth photograph from a drone overflight that had been conducted under the cover of a routine pattern, and a signals intercept summary that showed 3 transmission events from the facility in the past 18 hours, consistent with command-level communications. She sat with the imagery in the map room and built the Overwatch position in her head. The southern approach had a natural feature, a dry creek bed that ran roughly parallel to the facility's south wall, elevated about 15 feet above the vehicle area with scrub vegetation that would provide visual cover in daylight. The creek bed was 800 meters from the south end of the approach and approximately 380 to 420 from the vehicle area, depending on the specific firing position within the feature. 400 meters. Daylight, probably late afternoon insertion given the 6-kilometer ground approach from the south. The lighting conditions in the vehicle area at that hour would be workable, not optimal, but workable. She was sketching the position angles when Breck came in. He sat down across from her and looked at the imagery without speaking. After a moment, "Talk me through it." She did. She laid out the approach route, the overwatch position, the trigger mechanism, a controlled exposure by the capture element designed to draw whoever was inside the facility into the vehicle area, where she could confirm identification before the element made a move. Breck listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked at the imagery for a moment. "The exposure window," he said. 30 seconds. 30 pod. You create a noise event on the eastern perimeter. Nothing aggressive. Something that reads as a recon probe. If Draven is in command of that facility, he moves to assess. Command types do. She pointed at the vehicle area. That's the most likely assessment position. He needs line of sight to the eastern approach, and the vehicle area gives it. Or he sends someone else. Then we reevaluate. But Draven's pattern, based on what Calloway briefed, is personal command assessment. He's not a delegate and wait operator. He'll want eyes on the probe. Breck was quiet for a moment. "And if we need to take him and he's too far inside the facility for capture?" She looked at him. He met her eyes. He was asking the real question, which was the question about what happened when the intelligence mission hit the edge of its operational parameters. "Then we take what we can get," she said. He held her gaze for a second. Then he looked at the imagery. "Garza is good," he said. "He's been with Halder's element for 2 years. You don't know him, but he's solid." "I can see that." "He's also going to ask you questions. A lot of them. He processes by talking." He picked up one of the imagery prints and looked at it. "Just letting you know so you don't think he's challenging you." She nodded. He put the print down. He stood up. "Mogadishu, Keek," he said for the second time, still not a question. "Don't," she said. He looked at her. "Whatever you're trying to piece together," she said, "piece it together after this mission, not before." He held it for a moment. Then he nodded, and there was something in the nod. That same minimal degree of acknowledgement, but slightly different. Less recalibration this time. More alignment. He walked out. She went back to the imagery and kept working. The 6-kilometer ground approach took 4 hours and 11 minutes. They moved at night, slow and deliberate, Halder setting the pace, Breck and Garza on the flanks, Maya in the rear despite the shoulder, which was the argument she'd won in a conversation with Rourke that lasted approximately 90 seconds. The terrain was not as hostile as the first mission's valley. Lower elevation, less wind, the vegetation providing both cover and the particular crackling problem that vegetation always presented. They moved through it the way the team had learned to move together, without unnecessary communication, each person reading the ground and the others through peripheral awareness and the small physical language of operators who have trained until the language is automatic. At 3 kilometers, Garza came alongside her during a hold and said quietly, "The creek bed position. You measured the elevation differential from the imagery or from a map?" "Both," she said. "Imagery gives you the visual, map gives you the numbers. When they disagree, I go with the imagery." "When do they disagree?" "More often than you'd think, especially in terrain where ground subsidence or erosion has changed the actual profile since the last map update." She watched the tree line ahead during the hold. The creek bed in the imagery shows vegetative growth patterns consistent with water movement, which tells me the drainage is active. Active drainage means the bed has been reshaped in the past 6 to 18 months. The map has it at 12 feet of elevation differential. I'm planning for 9 to 10. Garza was quiet for a moment, then, "Okay." "Okay as in you follow that reasoning, or okay as in you're done asking questions?" She could hear something in the dark that was almost a smile. "Both." Halder's hand came up at the front of the element, and they held for 2 full minutes while something moved in the tree line to the northeast. An animal, probably. The movement pattern wrong for human bipedal movement, too irregular. They watched it resolve into nothing and moved. At 5 kilometers, the facility became visible on the thermal. A low shape against the colder signature of the surrounding terrain, the internal heat of occupied buildings bleeding through the walls in the characteristic ghost-white glow of occupied structures. Occupied. She counted heat signatures. Hard to be precise at this range with the vegetation between them, but she was reading at minimum 3, possibly 5 individual signatures within the primary structure. She keyed the radio. 1 click. The prearranged signal for occupied continue approach. Halder's click came back immediately. 2 clicks. Copy, continue. The creek bed was where the imagery said it would be. She found it by feel. The edge of the vegetation giving way, the ground dropping under her first foot before she'd expected it, the 9-foot differential landing exactly where she'd planned for it. She settled into the position and got behind the M200. The weapon was on her good shoulder. They'd discussed this, and she'd declined Sandoval's alternative proposals because the M200's cheek weld and grip geometry worked with the right shoulder in ways that would have required relearning on a borrowed weapon. And this was not the moment for borrowed weapons. The bad shoulder was the support, the forward hand, the minimal engagement. It would do. The vehicle area was visible through the scope. Empty. Dark. 2 vehicles parked on the western side. A truck and what looked like a Land Cruiser, both cold, not recently used. She keyed Halder. 1 click. Position set, no activity in vehicle area. 2 clicks back. Copy. Standby. She waited. The facility was quiet for 19 minutes. Through the scope, she could see the lit windows of the primary structure, interior movement, shadows crossing the panes, the ordinary domestic business of people who were in a building and had no immediate reason to believe anyone was watching them. She counted the shadows. 3 distinct movement patterns. 1 stationary heat signature near the window, seated. 1 mobile between 2 points in the eastern room. 1 at the back of the structure, intermittent. At minute 20, Halder's click came. 3 short. Initiating. She heard it 30 seconds later. A single sharp sound from the facility's eastern perimeter. Something metallic against stone. The kind of sound that could have been animal, could have been debris. Could have been exactly what it was. The shadows inside the building changed. The mobile figure stopped. The seated figure stood. The intermittent figure in the back went still. Then the door on the south side of the primary structure opened. 1 person. Moving toward the vehicle area with the particular walk of someone accustomed to walking toward things that might be problems. Not hurried, controlled. The walk of command. Maya tracked through the scope. The figure moved into the vehicle area, stopped near the Land Cruiser, and looked northeast, toward the eastern perimeter, toward the sound. The left arm was visible. She dialed the scope's magnification and locked on the left forearm. In the ambient light from the facility's single exterior fixture, she could see it. 3 parallel scars running diagonally across the forearm, visible even at this range and this light, the characteristic pattern of close-range fragmentation. Not the clean lines of a blade, but the irregular constellation of metal that had moved through tissue and left its signature behind. 2 identifiers, Calloway's threshold. She keyed the radio twice. Deliberate, clear, confirmed. For 4 seconds, nothing happened. Then Rourke's voice came through on the command net. Not Halder's tactical net, but the command channel she'd been monitoring on the secondary radio at her hip. His voice was clipped and very controlled. Iron Wolf, confirm your last. She pressed transmit. Confirmed. 2 identifiers. Positive ID. A 2-second silence. Copy positive ID. A pause. Capture element is cleared to move. She kept the scope on the vehicle area. The figure was still looking northeast. He was still stationary. Then something changed in the way he was standing. It was subtle. A shift of weight. A slight rotation of the head. And she had the abrupt and unpleasant sense that she was watching a man whose instincts were very good and who was listening to something that had nothing to do with sounds. Breck, she said into the tactical net. He's reading it. He's about to move. 20 seconds, Breck came back. He doesn't have 20 seconds. She kept the scope on the figure. Go now, south side. A 1-second beat, then, moving. The figure in the vehicle area turned. He turned south, toward the creek bed, toward her position, and in the scope, across 390 meters of cold mountain air, Victor Draven looked directly at the dark. He couldn't see her. The position was good and she was prone and motionless, and there was no light source behind her. He couldn't see her, but something in the quality of his stillness said that he was looking at the right place. She heard the capture element breach the south door. She heard the sounds that followed. Not shots, the ROE was capture, but the controlled violence of a close-quarters apprehension, the particular noise of people who are very good at what they do meeting something that is also very good at what it does. Through the scope, Draven was moving, not toward the sounds, away from them, toward the vehicle. He's going for the Land Cruiser, she said. We're 15 seconds out, Breck came back. The Land Cruiser's lights came on. She did not fire. The ROE was capture. The ROE said capture was the priority, that lethal force was the last resort, that Victor Draven alive was worth more than the alternative. The Land Cruiser's engine turned over. Breck, he's in the vehicle. On him! Breck's voice had the particular flat compression of someone running and speaking simultaneously. The Land Cruiser moved. It moved fast. Too fast for the terrain, the wheels spinning on the loose surface before finding traction. The vehicle fishtailing left and then right before the driver corrected. He was good. The vehicle was moving south, which meant it was moving toward the only road that led away from the facility, and the road went through the creek bed. Through the creek bed. The creek bed where she was positioned. She pulled the M200 back from the edge of the position and moved laterally, 15 feet left, where the vegetation thinned and the ground opened, and she had a firing line to the road that came up from the south. The ROE was capture. If the vehicle stopped, the capture element could reach it. If the vehicle did not stop. The Land Cruiser hit the creek bed approach at speed and did what vehicles do when they hit a 9-foot elevation differential they didn't know was there. The front end dropped. The underbody hit the creek bed floor with a sound like artillery. The vehicle rocked forward and stopped. The driver's door opened. Draven came out running. He was moving north, back toward the facility, back toward the sounds of the capture element. He was going to run through his own team, she realized, and she understood immediately. He wasn't trying to escape. He was trying to reach the facility's back structure. He's running north, she said, back toward you. Watch for him coming in from the south. She came out of the creek bed on a diagonal that would cut his angle, moving fast with the Glock, because the M200 was not a running weapon, the shoulder telling her very clearly what it thought about running in the dark on uneven terrain. She didn't stop for the shoulder's opinion. Draven was fast. 50 yards north, moving hard, the facility lights ahead of him. She was cutting the angle and she was gaining, but not fast enough. Then Breck came around the east side of the facility and they stopped. Both of them, simultaneously, 10 meters apart in the open ground between the creek bed and the south wall. Draven looked at Breck. He looked at Maya coming in from the south. He looked at the Glock in her right hand. Then he looked at her face and something moved through his expression. A recalculation. The look of a man who has processed new data and found that it requires him to revise something he previously thought was settled. He said something she didn't catch. Not English, Russian, maybe, or something close to it. Hands, she said. Show me your hands. He looked at her for 2 more seconds. Then he put his hands out to his sides. Breck was on him in 3 steps. The takedown was clean and professional and put Draven face down in the mountain dirt with his arms behind him in approximately 4 seconds. Maya held the Glock on the position and controlled her breathing until it was back to something workable. The facility was quiet. The secondary fire sounds from inside had stopped. Halder's voice came on the net. Building clear. 2 in custody. 1 non-combatant, female, probable local national. No casualties on our side. She lowered the Glock. Breck was looking at her from where he was kneeling on Draven's back, applying the flex cuffs. His expression was the one she'd been seeing more of in the past 24 hours. The expression of someone whose revised model is still catching up to the evidence. Draven's face was turned sideways in the dirt. He was breathing. He was looking at her. He said something. This time she caught it. You are not who they told me you were. She looked at him for a moment. No, she said, I'm not. She walked to the creek bed to recover the M200, and the mountains held their cold and indifferent silence around all of them. They brought Draven back in the Land Cruiser. Breck drove. Halder sat in the rear with Draven between him and Garza, and Draven sat with his wrists flex-cuffed behind him and his eyes forward and said nothing for the entire 40-minute drive back to the exfil point where Rourke had a vehicle waiting. He was not the kind of man who talked when talking would cost him. Maya had understood that from the moment he'd put his hands out, the calculation visible, the submission tactical rather than genuine, a man buying time and filing information and waiting for the situation to present something he could use. She sat in the front passenger seat with the M200 case between her knees and watched the road in the headlights and listened to the sound of Draven breathing. He breathed evenly, like someone in a waiting room, like someone who had been in worse places than the back of a Land Cruiser and had learned that the body's insistence on drama was a resource to be managed rather than indulged. She respected that, in the abstract way you can respect a quality in a person whose entire existence has been oriented toward things you are specifically trying to stop. At the exfil point, Rourke was standing beside a black SUV with two people she didn't recognize. Civilian clothes, the particular posture of intelligence professionals, Calloway's world rather than Rourke's. They watched Draven come out of the Land Cruiser with the focused attention of people who have been waiting a long time for a specific delivery. Draven looked at them. He looked at Rourke. Then he looked at Maya. He said nothing. One of the civilians put a hand on his arm and guided him toward a second vehicle. Draven went without resistance, which was the most unsettling thing about him. He moved through every situation with the same quality of assent, as if the situation were his idea. Rourke watched the vehicle leave. Then he turned to the team. Good work, he said. 2 words. The kind of delivery that doesn't need more. Halder nodded. Breck looked at the road. Garza was checking his kit. Rourke looked at Maya's shoulder, at the way she was holding the M200 case, at the evidence of 6 hours of ground movement on top of the previous night's wound. Ferris is going to make my life difficult, he said. Ferris makes everyone's life difficult, she said. It's part of his job. Rourke almost smiled. It was a brief thing, more in the eyes than the face, and it was gone before it fully arrived. Load up, he said. We debrief at 0700. The 0700 debrief had more people in it than the previous one. 2 additional intelligence officers who had apparently arrived at the FOB in the night. A general officer on secure video. She could see the star on his collar and the unmistakable quality of someone watching everything very carefully from a distance. Calloway, who looked like he had not slept. Rourke. Halder. Breck. Rice, who had been cleared by Ferris that morning and who sat at the end of the table with a cup of coffee, and the expression of someone who is present in body but processing things that are not in the room. And a man named Colonel Richard Hayes, who had flown in from Regional Command and who sat at Rourke's left, and who Maya had never met but whose presence in the room had a specific gravitational quality. The gravitational quality of someone who has come to this room with an agenda and is waiting for the appropriate moment to introduce it. Hayes was in his mid-50s, silver hair, cut short. Face like something administrative, not unkind but organized, the face of a man who manages things and has been doing it long enough that the management has become the dominant expression. He had read the mission reports on the flight in. She was certain of that. And he had formed opinions, and those opinions were sitting in the room with him. The debrief opened with Rourke walking through the second mission in sequence. Approach, Overwatch establishment, positive identification, capture attempt, vehicle pursuit, final apprehension. He was concise and accurate, and she noticed that he presented the AT-4 employment from the first mission in the same direct and unembellished way, without commentary. The way you present facts to a room that is going to have feelings about them, and you want those feelings to arrive from the facts rather than from your framing. Hayes listened with his hands flat on the table. When Rourke finished, Hayes looked at the general on the screen, then at the room. He looked at Maya. Lieutenant Voss, he said. Sir, walk me through the decision to leave the Overwatch position during the first mission. She walked him through it, the same way she'd walked Rice through it. The storm, the visibility collapse, the threat assessment on the valley floor, the anti-armor gap in the team's organic capabilities, the destroyed vehicle, and its cargo. Hayes listened with the particular quality of someone who is listening for a specific thing. At the point where you decided to leave the ridge, he said, you had not received authorization from Colonel Rourke to change your position. Correct. And you were not in radio contact with Colonel Rourke at that moment. The command net was saturated with ground element traffic. The decision needed to be made inside a time window that didn't accommodate a full authorization cycle. So you made a unilateral decision to abandon your assigned position. The word abandon sat in the room. She looked at him. I made a tactical decision to reposition from an ineffective position to a position where I could address the team's most critical threat. The ridgeline was operationally useless in those visibility conditions. Staying on it would have been the same as not being on the mission. That's a judgment you made without authorization. Yes. Hayes was quiet for a moment. And the AT-4 employment. The same logic applies. The team had no organic anti-armor capability. The BRDM's thermal tracking made the storm irrelevant as concealment. Without addressing the vehicle, the team's position was untenable. She kept her voice even. I identified a possible asset, recovered it, confirmed it was functional, and engaged within the rules of engagement. You recovered a weapon system from a destroyed asset in an active engagement zone. Yes. That weapon system was unaccounted materiel. It was also the only available solution to an immediate threat to 6 people. Hayes looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at his notes. Rourke spoke from the end of the table. Colonel, the decisions Lieutenant Voss made during the first mission are the reason we have a live asset, a rescued DIA officer, and the capture of Victor Draven 48 hours later. I've documented that position in the mission report. I've read your report, Ethan. Hayes' voice was not hostile. That was the thing about him. His entire manner was not hostile, which made it harder to read than hostility would have been. I'm asking about the process. The process worked, Halder said. Hayes looked at Halder. Halder met his eyes without adjustment. Master Chief, Hayes said. Sir, you had an operator exit a critical position without authorization in an active engagement. The outcome was favorable. I understand that. But the pattern, Halder said, is an operator who assessed the situation correctly and acted on it. In my experience, that's what we want operators to do. The room was quiet, in the way rooms go quiet when a senior NCO says something accurate and inconvenient to a senior officer. Hayes looked at his notes again. Maya understood what was happening. She'd been in rooms like this before, in smaller versions, earlier in her career. The review that follows a successful operation that succeeded in ways that made people in buildings uncomfortable. The conversation about process that is really a conversation about control. She waited. Lieutenant Voss, Hayes said, before this assignment, tell me about Mogadishu. The room changed, not dramatically. Rourke's expression didn't move, and Halder's didn't. But she felt the attention of everyone who didn't already know redistribute itself. Breck was very still. I was on a training attachment to a special activities unit, she said, 18 months ago. The attachment was a marksmanship consultation. I was brought in to assess their long-range precision program. And during that attachment, an operation that the unit was conducting encountered an unexpected complication. I was present. You were present, Hayes said. He opened a folder that he'd been carrying and had not yet looked at in the room. He was looking at it now. The combat action report from that engagement describes an embedded advisor who, during a 22-minute engagement in a building in Mogadishu, provided direct fire support from an improvised position on the building's 4th floor and enabled the extraction of 6 contractors and 1 local national from a situation that the responding elements on the ground assessed as non-survivable. He looked up. The embedded advisor is not named in the report. The Special Activities Unit that filed it has a practice of not naming embedded personnel. He paused. It took me until last night to confirm who the embedded advisor was. Maya said nothing. You were a marksmanship instructor, Hayes said. On a training attachment. Yes. And you found yourself on the 4th floor of a building in Mogadishu providing direct fire support during a non-survivable situation. I was the only person in the building who was in a position to do it. That's not an answer to my question. It's the answer that explains the outcome, she said. which was that 6 people got out. Hayes looked at her for a long moment. He had intelligent eyes. She'd been noting this since he sat down, the kind of eyes that process what they're looking at rather than just recording it. Your official record, he said, describes 1 combat deployment, 18 months as a marksmanship instructor, and this assignment. It does not describe Mogadishu beyond the training attachment designation. He closed the folder. Your actual experience is considerably broader than your official record reflects. The room waited. She kept her eyes on Hayes. My official record reflects what was classified at the level of the operations I was involved in. Which operations? Which I can't discuss in this room at the current classification level of this debrief. The general on the screen leaned forward slightly. The 2 intelligence officers from Calloway's world exchanged a look that was very brief and very specific. Hayes looked at Rourke. Rourke looked back at him with an expression that was entirely neutral, which was not the same as uninformed. Ethan, Hayes said. Richard, Rourke said. A beat. Did you know? Hayes said. Not did you know about Mogadishu, just did you know? I knew enough, Rourke said, to make the assignment. Hayes sat back. He looked at the table. He was doing what people do when they've arrived at a room expecting to be the person with the most information and have found that the information landscape is different than they expected. I see, he said. He was quiet for 7 seconds. Maya counted them. Then he closed the folder and looked at the general on the screen. Sir, I think I have what I need for the process review. The general nodded once. Colonel Hayes, what's your assessment? Hayes looked at Maya. He looked at her the way Rourke had looked at her in the briefing room before the first mission, the way a person looks at something they have decided what to do with. My assessment, he said, is that the process deviations documented in Colonel Rourke's report were within the decision authority of an operator in a degraded and time-critical situation, and that the outcomes justify the assessment. A pause. My further assessment is that Lieutenant Voss's file needs to be revised to reflect her actual operational background, and that whoever classified it at the current level did her and the system a disservice. The room absorbed this. Breck's jaw moved. He was looking at the table. Agreed, the general said on the screen. Get me the revision package by end of week. He looked at the room, the slight head movement of someone on video who is trying to address a space they can see in 2 dimensions. Victor Draven is with the appropriate people. Captain Rice is being debriefed by his section. The source network penetration is an ongoing problem, and I don't want to hear the Korvath sector mentioned in a press context at any level. He looked at Rourke. Good work, Colonel. The screen went dark. Hayes gathered his folder. He stood. He looked at Maya one more time, and there was something in it that was neither apology nor its opposite, just the acknowledgement of a man who has updated his model. He walked out. The room exhaled. Not dramatically. Just the small, collective release of people who have been sitting in a particular kind of tension and are now no longer required to. Calloway stayed after the others filed out. He sat at the end of the table with his laptop open and a cup of coffee that was clearly not his first, looking at something on the screen that required him to scroll periodically, but not to type. He had the quality of a man who has been running on adrenaline and task completion for 72 hours and has not yet registered that the task is complete. Maya was gathering her notebook from the table when he looked up. The signal's intelligence from the compound, he said. From the first mission. My section finished the preliminary analysis this morning. She waited. Draven had been in the Korvath sector for 11 months. He said it the way people say things that have taken a long time to confirm and are worse than expected. He wasn't a random element that wandered into our operational area. He was specifically positioned here. He looked at his screen. The communications pattern suggests he was running a broader assessment of this sector's operational picture. Every SEAL mission in the past 11 months that originated from Red Talon. Every DIA contact in the area. Captain Rice was not the primary objective. He was a test to see what the response would look like. He was studying us, she said. For 11 months. Yes. Calloway closed the laptop. He had files on the team, on Rourke, on Halder, on Breck. He looked at her. On you, or rather, on what he thought was you, based on your official record. A pause. He assessed you as the element most likely to create a gap in the team's capability. The Overwatch position, in his planning, was the designated vulnerability. She thought about Rice's words in her quarters. The asset they deploy to Overwatch will be the limiting factor. He was planning to exploit the position, she said. Yes. He had a second element positioned to flank the ridgeline once the compound engagement was underway. The storm disrupted that element's movement. By the time they had visibility, you were no longer on the ridge. Calloway looked at his coffee. He had a very complete picture of your unit, an incomplete picture of you. She looked at the wall where the satellite imagery had been, the compound, the valley, the ridgeline where she'd been and then hadn't been. The file, she said, is being revised as of this morning. Calloway looked at her. For what it's worth, I pulled your original file 3 weeks ago when Rourke requested the consult on team composition. The version I read had the Mogadishu attachment and one note appended to it that was above the standard classification of the file itself. It took me a day to get access to the note. He paused. The note was from the Special Activities Unit commander. It said, this officer's actual operational record is classified at compartmented level. The attached summary reflects cover documentation only. Recommend extreme caution in any assignment context where this distinction is not understood. She was quiet. Rourke understood the distinction, Calloway said. Hayes didn't. I wanted you to know that. She picked up her notebook. Why? Because the people in this FOB spent the past several days forming opinions about you based on a file that was specifically designed to be insufficient. He looked at his coffee. That seems like something worth knowing. She looked at him. He was not performing. He was just saying the thing directly, with the particular exhaustion of a man who has been doing intelligence work long enough to find the gap between information and understanding reliably depressing. Thank you, she said. Don't. He waved it off. I'm going to sleep for 12 hours. If anyone needs me, tell them I died. She walked out. Ooh. The FOB in daylight, after all of it, had the same smell it always had. She stood outside the debrief room in the morning light with her arm in the sling and her notebook under her good arm and looked at the mountains. The Korvath peaks were clear today, the storm entirely gone, the sky running blue all the way to the ridge lines, the granite showing its true color in the direct light, which was a gray so pale it was almost white. Somewhere on the northern face, at 892 meters from a compound that was now empty and would be stripped by intelligence teams within the week, there was a shelf of rock where she had spent the worst and most important hours of her professional life. She was looking at it when Breck found her. He came to stand beside her, not at a respectful distance, beside her, and looked at the mountains. They stood like that for a while. Neither of them spoke. The FOB moved around them with its ordinary morning sounds, the motor pool, the generators, someone calling across the compound about a vehicle schedule. Somalia, Breck said finally. Not Mogadishu this time. Somalia. She didn't answer. 3 years ago, he said. There was a report. Buried. You'd have to know what you were looking for. An unacknowledged operation in the southern sector. One sniper, embedded with a CT unit from a partner nation, called in and executed 4 long-range engagements over a 20-hour period during a hostage situation. The hostages got out. The sniper was never publicly identified. He paused. The distances in that report. One of the shots was listed at over 1,400 meters. She kept looking at the mountains. I wasn't looking for it, Breck said. I was looking for something else, and it was adjacent. He was quiet for a moment. And then there's the instructor record at SOCOM, which lists your qualification scores, but not what course you were instructing, which is unusual. Instructors get listed with their course. Yours just says Advanced Precision Program. That's what it was. What was it actually? She looked at him. He met her eyes. An Advanced Precision Program, she said, and there was something in her tone that was not quite closing the door, more like noting that the door existed and choosing not to walk through it right now. Breck looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back at the mountains. Hayes' people are going to rebuild your file, he said. When they do, some of the people in this FOB are going to see it. I know, That's going to be a conversation. It'll be a short one, she said. Something in his face, not a smile, but the structural precursor to one, the thing that happens in the face before the decision to smile is made. Yeah, he said. Probably. He put his hands in his pockets. He was still looking at the mountains. Petrov, he said. Yes. He would have liked you. Breck's voice was even, but there was a texture underneath it. He was the one guy in the briefing room who didn't make a judgment. He'd just watched. She hadn't known that. She put it with the rest of what she carried about Petrov. The name, the daughter who was 8 months old, the photograph in the briefing room, and now this. I know, she said, which was not accurate but felt more true than saying she hadn't known. They stood there for another minute. Then Breck pulled his hands out of his pockets and turned toward the motor pool. Ferris wants to look at your shoulder again at 1100, he said over his shoulder. I know. He's going to tell you the same thing he told you before. I know that too. Breck walked away. She watched him go. The particular walk of a man who has been through something and has not finished processing it and is not going to rush the processing. She turned back to the mountains. Ferris did tell her the same thing at 1100, with the additional emphasis of a medical professional who has had 12 more hours to feel strongly about his position. The tissue damage, he said, pressing 2 fingers into the lateral aspect of the shoulder with something that was technically examination but felt punitive, is significant. The fact that you ran on it and then spent 6 hours on a ground movement has introduced inflammation that I'm going to be dealing with for longer than I would have been if you'd come to me when you landed. I understand. I don't think you do. He released the shoulder and made a note on his tablet. Full range of motion. I'm revising my estimate to 8 to 10 weeks, possibly 12 if the inflammation doesn't respond to treatment. What does light duty look like at week 3? He looked at her over the tablet. Light duty at week 3 looks like administrative functions and range work at static positions. No field movement, no load bearing with that arm. He put the tablet down. I'm going to say something to you that you're not going to want to hear. Go ahead. The shot you fired the AT-4 with. That shoulder was the support arm. Yes. The AT-4 generates approximately 12 kilonewtons of recoil impulse at the support contact point, distributed through whatever tissue is in contact with the weapon at the time of firing. He looked at her. You fired it with a partially torn deltoid. The target needed to be addressed. The tissue damage I'm looking at is not exclusively from the gunshot wound. He held her gaze. You tore the deltoid further when you fired. You were running on a shoulder that was failing while it was under load. She said nothing. I'm not telling you this to make a point about the decision, Ferris said. I'm telling you because you need to understand why the recovery timeline has changed, and because the next time someone is designing a mission around your capabilities, they should probably know that your pain tolerance is, he paused, looking for a word, non-representative. She looked at him. Non-representative. Meaning that you will not communicate accurate information about your physical status under operational pressure, which is both a capability and a problem. He picked up the tablet again. I'm putting it in the medical notes. I understand. He was quiet for a moment, doing something on the tablet. You're going to be fine, he said, without looking up. The shoulder will heal. It's going to hurt considerably in the short term, and moderately for longer than that, but you'll have full function. He put the tablet down. I wanted to say that also. She looked at him. He was not looking at her. He was putting away his examination tools with the brisk efficiency of a doctor who has made his point and moved on. Thank you, she said. Week 3. Static range work only. He did not look up. That's non-negotiable, Lieutenant. She got off the examination table and picked up her sling. Reese found her in the afternoon. He was in better condition than the night before. He'd slept, which showed in his eyes, and he'd eaten enough that the vacant quality had started to fill in at the edges. He was still not okay, but he was more specifically not okay, which was an improvement. He came to the map room, where she was reviewing the signals intelligence summary that Calloway's section had released after the debrief. He knocked on the frame and came in when she looked up. They're flying me out tomorrow, he said. Full debrief at the agency, then medical leave, then whatever comes after that. He looked at the maps on the wall. I wanted to see you before I left. She waited. During the interrogations, he said, Draven asked me about the team. He had files. He would describe people and ask me to confirm details, and I wouldn't confirm anything, but he would read from the files anyway, as if he was just reviewing information he already had. He paused. When he got to you, he read for about 40 seconds, and then he said, "This one is not a concern." Those were his words, not a concern. And I remember thinking, I don't know this person. I don't know if that's accurate, but something about the certainty bothered me. He looked at her. And then the night you extracted me, I watched you come through the east wall with a gunshot wound and the empty sling from an AT-4, and I thought, he was wrong about that. He was working from bad information, she said. He's not a person who works from bad information, Rice said. He's been doing this for 20 years. He's very careful about his information. A pause. Which means whoever built the version of you that ended up in his files was very careful too. And what they built was designed to look like exactly what he expected to see. She kept her eyes on the signals summary. I don't know what your actual history is, Rice said. I'm not asking, but I know what it looks like when someone has been made to look smaller than they are, and I know what it costs. He stood for a moment. That's all I wanted to say. He walked out. She sat with the signal summary and the maps and the afternoon light coming through the single window and thought about the version of herself that existed in Draven's files. The marksmanship instructor from Billings, Montana. 1 deployment, 18 months of teaching. The version that was not a concern. She thought about her father, who had understood precision as a conversation between a shooter and a weapon. Who had taught her that what looks like patience is really sustained attention. Who had died when she was 23 without knowing what she'd done with what he'd given her, because the things she'd done were not the kind of things that got told to fathers. She thought about Petrov's daughter, 8 months old, who would grow up with a photograph and a story that would take years to be old enough to understand. She put the signals summary down. Outside, through the window, the Korvath Mountains caught the late afternoon light at angles that made the ridgelines look like the edge of something, the edge of the known territory, the edge of the map, the edge of whatever came next. She picked up her notebook and opened it to a clean page. She wrote the date at the top. Then she wrote 2 words, Petrov M., and the date he died, which she would carry the way she carried the others, without ceremony, without needing to explain it to anyone, just present in whatever she did next. She closed the notebook. The afternoon held the mountains in its cold light, and the mountains held their silence, and the FOB held its ordinary sounds. And somewhere in a facility she would never see, Victor Draven was sitting across from people who had been waiting 11 months for exactly this conversation. And Lieutenant Maya Voss, who was not a concern, sat in the map room and thought about what came after. What came after was 3 weeks of Ferris. 3 weeks of the shoulder being measured and documented and pressed and released and measured again, of range of motion assessments that felt more like negotiations than medicine. Of Ferris writing things on his tablet with the focused displeasure of a man whose professional opinion had been structurally ignored and who intended to register that displeasure in every subsequent interaction for the foreseeable future. She did the exercises. All of them, in the correct sequence, at the correct intervals. Not because Ferris was watching, though sometimes he was, but because the shoulder was the tool and the tool needed to work. And that was a logic she'd understood since she was 16 years old learning to clean a rifle she hadn't yet fired. The FOB moved through its rhythms around her. Missions she wasn't on. Briefings she attended in a consultative capacity, which was the administrative category Rourke had used when submitting her light-duty status. A category that meant she was present and contributing without carrying a weapon into terrain that would demand things her shoulder couldn't currently deliver. She read the intelligence summaries. She ran the signals analysis on the Draven Communications Archive that Calloway's section forwarded to Red Talon. She sat in on planning sessions and said the things she saw when she saw them and did not say things she didn't see. It was not the worst 3 weeks of her life. It was not even close to the worst 3 weeks of her life. But it was a different kind of hard than the hard she knew. The hard of being in a room where things were happening and being the person who had to watch them happen from the chairs along the wall. On the 14th day, Rourke came to the map room at 0730 with 2 cups of coffee and a folder. He set one cup in front of her without asking if she wanted it, and sat down across the table and opened the folder. "Draven's debrief is complete," he said. She waited. "He talked," Rourke said. "Not immediately and not without process. But he talked." He looked at a page in the folder. 11 months in the Korvath sector. 2 separate source networks penetrated. 7 operations compromised in total, including Rice's original capture, which he confirmed was a directed action rather than an opportunistic one. Rice was identified because of a meeting in Tashkent 14 months ago that was under surveillance we didn't know about. He turned a page. The second location, the one you identified from the AT-4 angle, the fact that the BRDM was pre-staged, he confirmed all of it. The compound ambush was designed to hold our team in contact long enough for a secondary element to close and capture the entire unit. "The ridgeline flanking element," she said. "Yes. They lost their approach window in the storm and never reached their position." He looked at her. "If the storm had come in 30 minutes later, they would have been on that ridge when you were there." She picked up the coffee. "He also talked about you," Rourke said. She set the coffee down. "Not at length, but the debrief team asked him directly, after they'd confirmed his identity and established his cooperation, what his assessment of the operation's failure was." Rourke looked at the folder. He said, "The Overwatch element did not behave according to profile. I had assessed a constraint that was not present. This was an intelligence failure on my part." He looked up. "That's a direct quote. They sent it over this morning." "He's not wrong," she said. "No." Rourke closed the folder. "The intelligence failure on his part began with whoever built your cover file and the decision to build it the way they did." He paused. "I want to talk to you about that." She looked at him. "The revision process for your record," he said. "Hayes's people sent me the preliminary draft last week. I've been sitting on it because I wanted to talk to you first." He put the folder aside. "The draft reveals the Somalia operation, the Mogadishu engagement, and 4 prior operations in the compartmented record going back to your 2nd year of service. Once it's revised and filed at the appropriate level, anyone with the correct clearance who pulls your record is going to see a substantially different picture of who you are." "I know." "The Special Activities Unit that ran those operations classified your participation for specific reasons. Some of those reasons were operational security. Some of them were," he paused, "less generous." She looked at him. "They didn't want a record that was inconvenient." He held her gaze. "That's my assessment, yes." She picked up the coffee again. It was the kind of truth she'd been carrying for long enough that it had lost its acute quality. It was just part of the landscape now, like the shoulder, a constraint, something you worked with. "The revision goes forward," she said. "That's my recommendation." "Then it goes forward." Rourke nodded. He closed the folder and put it on his side of the table, which was not where he'd had it when he came in, and she understood that the folder was now his problem rather than hers, which was how it was supposed to work. "One more thing," he said. She waited. "There's a program," he said. "Advanced Precision Instruction. Not at SOCOM. At the Consolidated Special Operations Schoolhouse, where the curriculum is built for cross-service application. The program currently doesn't exist in a form that reflects current operational demands. It was designed 15 years ago, and it hasn't been fundamentally updated." He looked at her. "The request for someone to lead its redesign has been on my desk for 2 months. I've been holding it because I didn't have the right person for it." She looked at him. "You would be returning stateside," he said. "Curriculum development, instruction, program design. It's not field work. It's also not nothing. What you build would go into every precision operator who comes through that schoolhouse for the next decade." He paused. "And the shoulder would have time to actually heal." "You're not reassigning me," she said. "No, I'm offering you a choice." He said it clearly. "You can stay here for the duration of your attachment, which has 8 months remaining, and return to field operations when Ferris clears you. Or you can take the schoolhouse program, which has no defined end date and would require a formal reassignment request." He looked at her. "I'm not steering you. I'm telling you both things exist." She looked at the mountains through the window, the Korvath peaks in the morning light, The same peaks she'd been looking at for 6 weeks now, showing her the same ridgeline from a different angle every time the light changed. "The program," she said. "Has it been attempted before?" "3 times. 2 of the previous leads left because the institutional resistance was significant. The third completed a draft curriculum that was rejected by the Oversight Committee on grounds that were," he chose the word carefully, "political." "Political how?" The curriculum they proposed included scenario-based assessment that evaluated operators on decision-making in compromised conditions. The committee felt it was too subjective. He paused. "The committee has since been partially reorganized, but the resistance isn't gone." She looked at him. "You're telling me it's a hard thing." "I'm telling you what it is." He picked up his coffee. "Hard things tend to be your domain." She thought about the operators who would come through that schoolhouse. The ones who would sit in a briefing room like the one here and get looked at the way she'd been looked at. The ones who had the capacity and not yet the record that made the capacity legible to the people around them. The ones who would be sent to a ridge and expected to stay on it even when staying on it was the wrong call. She thought about what she could build, given a program and a curriculum and the institutional resistance that would make the building difficult enough to matter. "I'll take the program," she said. Rourke nodded once. He drank his coffee. They sat there for a while in the early morning of a FOB that smelled like jet fuel and field kitchen and machine oil. And the mountains held their light outside the window, and nothing dramatic happened, because the important decisions rarely look like anything from the outside. She told Halder first, because he was in the armory when she came to clean the M201 final time, and because the armory was where the conversations that didn't have a formal venue tended to happen. He listened to the 3 sentences it took to explain the reassignment without expression. Then he looked at the rifle on the bench. "The schoolhouse," he said. "Yes?" "You know what they're going to try to do with that program. Minimize it, or absorb it. Take the pieces that are convenient and leave the rest." He picked up a cleaning rod from the bench and put it down again, not because he needed it, just having something to do with his hands. "You're going to spend 2 years fighting an institution that doesn't want to be changed." "Probably." He looked at her. "You going to let that stop you?" "No." He nodded. He picked up the cleaning rod again and this time actually used it, running it through the barrel of a weapon that didn't need cleaning, because that was how Halder processed things. Through the hands, through the familiar action of maintaining something. "Petrov's wife," he said. "I wrote to her last week. Standard notification letter, then a personal one." He paused. "I told her about the daughter, that she would grow up knowing her father was the kind of man who—" He stopped. He was looking at the bore. It's hard to finish that sentence in a way that doesn't sound like something from a certificate. "Tell her what you told me," Maya said, "that he didn't make a judgment when everyone else did, that he just watched." Halder was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "That's better." He kept cleaning the barrel that didn't need cleaning, and she got behind the M200 and started her last check of it at Red Talon FOB, and the armory held them both in its particular silence, which was the silence of tools and the people who understood them. Breck was harder to find. She looked for him in the places she expected him, the motor pool, the range, the common area, and found him eventually at the perimeter wire, standing at the eastern corner where the wire met the rock face, looking at the Korvath peaks in the mid-afternoon light. He heard her coming. He didn't turn until she was beside him. "You're leaving," he said. "Word travels." "It's a small FOB." He was quiet for a moment. "The schoolhouse." "Yes." "Halder thinks you're going to spend 2 years fighting the institution." "Halder is usually right about these things." Breck looked at the peaks. "For what it's worth, and I know it's not worth as much as it should be, given how this started, I think it's the right call. Not just for you." He paused. "For whoever comes through that program and doesn't get looked at the way we looked at you." She looked at the wire, at the rock face beyond it, at the mountains beyond that. "Breck," she said. "Yeah." "You asked the right questions. In the armory, before the first mission." She looked at him. "The questions you asked about my experience? Those were the right questions to ask about someone who is going to be covering your team from 900 meters. The problem wasn't the questions. It was the information you had to ask them from. He was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the mountains. The Somalia report, he said. The one I found adjacent to what I was looking for. The shot at 1,400 meters. He paused. I've been doing this 12 years. I've met 3 shooters I'd call exceptional. He looked at her. The distance in that report is not something exceptional shooters do. It's something a different category of person does. She said nothing. I'm not asking, he said. I know you're not going to confirm it. I'm not going to confirm it. I know. He put his hands in his pockets. I just wanted to say that I know what I found, and that whatever the file says or doesn't say, I know what I found. She looked at the mountains for a while. Take care of the team, she said. That's my job. I know. Do it well. He looked at her. There was a moment where his face did the thing it did, the structural precursor to something that didn't fully arrive, and then he looked back at the mountains. You too, he said. Tut. She left Red Talon on a Thursday morning on the same kind of aircraft she'd arrived on, in the same kind of weather. Cold, clear, the peaks showing their full extent against a sky that had decided to be entirely blue for the occasion. Rourke walked her to the aircraft. He carried nothing. She carried the M200 case and her kit bag and the notebook that had the date and the coordinates and Petrov M written in it and nothing else that hadn't been there when she arrived. At the aircraft, he put out his hand. She shook it. His grip was the grip of a man who had decided something and was at peace with the decision. The Oversight Committee, he said, the one that rejected the previous curriculum. There are 2 members still on it from that iteration. Brigadier General Stokes and a civilian deputy director named Farr. He held her gaze. They are not going to make it easy. I know. Stokes in particular. He paused. He's going to look at you and make a judgment. She looked at him. People do that. Something moved through Rourke's face, thus something that had been accumulating for 6 weeks and was now, at the moment of departure, finding an expression. Lieutenant, he said, what you did in this sector, the compound, the second facility, the work in between, that goes in the record. Properly, completely, at the level it belongs. He paused. Nobody builds your file smaller than you are again. That's done. She held his gaze. Yes, sir, she said. He released her hand. She walked up the ramp. She didn't look back at the mountains because she had looked at them enough and she would carry the look of them without needing a final one. The schoolhouse was in Virginia, which was a different kind of landscape entirely. Flat where the Corvath sector was vertical, green where it was gray, loud in a different way. She reported to the program office on a Monday morning in October and met the administrative coordinator, a civilian woman in her 40s named Garrett, who had been running the logistics of the program through 3 previous leads and who greeted Maya with the focused competence of someone who had stopped being surprised by what walked through that door. The committee wants a preliminary curriculum overview by November 15th, Garrett said, showing her to an office that had been recently vacated by someone who had left a calendar on the wall from the wrong year. That gives you 7 weeks. What's the current curriculum's primary weakness? Garrett looked at her. She had the quality of someone who had opinions she had been professionally trained not to offer unsolicited. Tell me, Maya said. I'm going to find it anyway. Save me 3 weeks. Garrett put down the stack of files she was carrying. The current curriculum trains precision to standard. It does not train decision-making under operational degradation. Every operator who completes it can hit a target at distance under ideal conditions. Very few of them have been trained to assess when the ideal conditions are gone and what to do instead. She picked up the files again. That's the gap the previous lead tried to address and the committee said was too subjective to assess. Subjective, Maya said. Their word. Decision-making under degraded conditions is not subjective. It's the entire job. She looked at the wrong year calendar on the wall. Get me a meeting with the committee, as soon as they'll give me one. Garrett looked at her with an expression that was recalibrating something. They don't typically meet with program leads until the preliminary overview is submitted. I know. Get me the meeting anyway. A pause. I'll try. Tell them the new lead wants to discuss the curriculum's foundational objectives before developing materials that don't align with the committee's actual goals. She looked at Garrett. Frame it as deference. They'll respond to that. Something in Garrett's face moved. You've dealt with committees before. I've dealt with institutions before, Maya said. Committees are just institutions with fewer people in the room. Garrett nodded slowly. Then she set the files on the desk and said, I'll get you the meeting. The shoulder healed. Not on Ferris's timeline. The tissue found its own schedule, which was slightly ahead of his projections and slightly behind her preference, which put it somewhere in the reasonable middle that bodies tend to find when they're given the minimum required cooperation. By week 6 in Virginia, she was at the range 3 mornings a week. Static positions, as Ferris had specified, though Ferris was in the Corvath sector and his specifications had to travel a long way to reach her. She honored them more than she would have honored most things because Ferris had been right about the tissue damage and right about the timeline, and she had learned, slowly, that being right was the one credential she respected without reservation. The M200 spoke correctly when she asked it to. The first morning she got behind it after 6 weeks away from it, she'd expected the shoulder to make the cheek weld a negotiation. It was not a negotiation. It was exactly what it had always been. The rifle and the shooter, the conversation her father had described, the mutual preparation of two things that understood their purpose. She fired 7 rounds at 800 meters that first morning. 7 rounds, 7 targets. The groups were inside 2 inches. The range master, a retired sergeant major named Okafor, who'd been running this range for 11 years and who did not perform astonishment, looked at the target through his spotting scope for a long moment and said nothing, which was, at this particular range with these particular people, the appropriate response. The committee meeting happened in week 4. Stokes was exactly what Rourke had described. Mid-60s, silver, the bearing of a man who has been in rooms where decisions were made long enough to believe that the room was where the decision happened rather than the people in it. He looked at Maya with the assessment that Rourke had predicted and she had expected, and that landed with about the weight of weather. Present, notable, moving through. She let him finish looking. Then she put the single page she'd brought on the conference table. Not a presentation. 1 page. The foundational objective she intended for the revised program, stated in 23 words. Stokes looked at it. Farr, the civilian deputy director, looked at it. The 2 other committee members looked at it. This is not a curriculum overview, Stokes said. No, sir. It's a clarifying question. She looked at him. The previous curriculum was rejected because it included assessment of decision-making under operational degradation, which the committee assessed as too subjective to measure. She paused. Before I spend 7 weeks building a curriculum, I want to understand whether the committee's position on that point has changed. Stokes looked at her. It hasn't. Then I want to understand what evidence would change it. A pause. Farr looked at Stokes. Stokes looked at Maya. Evidence, Stokes said, if I can demonstrate a reliable assessment methodology for decision-making under degraded conditions, not subjective, not anecdotal, but measurable and reproducible, would the committee consider it? Stokes was quiet for a moment. That would depend on the methodology. I know, that's why I'm asking before I build it rather than after. She looked at the page on the table. I'm not here to fight the committee's position. I'm here to find out what it would take to change it. Those are different things. The room was quiet for a moment. Farr looked at the page. What's your proposed methodology? Scenario-based assessment with defined and measurable decision criteria. Not did the operator make the right choice? That's subjective. Instead, did the operator correctly identify the available information, accurately assess the constraints, and select from options consistent with their assessment? The outcome is secondary. The process is the measurement. She paused. Process is not subjective. Process is documentable. The room was quiet for longer this time. Stokes looked at the page. At her. At the page again. Submit the methodology as part of the preliminary overview, he said. November 15th. Yes, sir. He gathered his materials. He stood. At the door he stopped, not turning fully, just enough that she could see the edge of his face. Lieutenant, he said. Sir. The previous leads who came through this program. He paused. They led with the curriculum. You led with the committee. A beat. That's a different approach. Yes, sir. He walked out. Farr gathered his materials more slowly, and when he looked at her before leaving, his expression had been revised in a way that was small but legible. The door closed. Garrett, who had been in the room in a support capacity and who had been very still throughout, let out a breath. That went better than the previous lead's first committee meetings, she said. How did those go? One of them lasted 4 minutes before Stokes ended it. Garrett picked up her own materials. This one was 22. Maya looked at the single page still on the conference table. 23 words. The foundational objective. She picked it up. Garrett, she said. Yes. Find me every operator who has come through this program in the past 5 years and is currently in an active operational role. I want their field assessment records and their program completion assessments. She put the page in her folder. I want to see where the gaps are between what the program measured and what the field required. Garrett was looking at her with the expression she'd seen on various faces over the past 6 weeks. The expression of someone whose existing model has encountered new information and is in the process of revising. That's going to be a significant data pull, Garrett said. I know. It'll take me a week. Take the week, Maya said. It's the most important thing on the list. The file revision arrived in November. It came as a notification from the records section, a standard administrative email with a classification header, and she read it at 06:30 before the range, when the office was empty and the building had the particular quality of institutional spaces before the people arrived to fill them. The revised record was 27 pages. The previous version had been 6. She read it carefully, the way she read everything, completely, without skimming, with the attention that her father had described as the fundamental discipline. The attention that was not dramatic, not visible from the outside, just the sustained willingness to be present with what was in front of you until you understood it. She read about Somalia, which was no longer an adjacent note in a classified file, but a documented operation with her name attached to it. The 4 shots at distance, the 20-hour timeline, the outcome. She read about Mogadishu, which was no longer a training attachment but a combat action with a specific role and specific consequences, and her name on the appropriate line. She read about the operations before those, which she had been part of in ways that the previous file had described as consultative or advisory, and which the revised file described with the operational specificity that changed the meaning of the words. She read about the Korvath sector, both missions, the AT-4, the creek bed, the positive ID and the capture and the creek bed again, and Draven's words recorded in the after action. The Overwatch element did not behave according to profile. She read the final notation, which was Rourke's addendum, written in the direct prose of a man who trusted the facts to do the work without embellishment. Lieutenant Voss's performance in the Korvath sector was the decisive factor in the rescue of a captured intelligence officer, the capture of a high-value intelligence target, and the survival of a 6-person direct action element in a prepared ambush environment. Her record, as previously documented, did not reflect her actual operational history. This revision is intended to correct that discrepancy permanently and completely. She put the file down. Outside the window, Virginia in November was a particular kind of gray, not the gray of the Korvath granite, which had a blue undertone and a mineral hardness to it, but the softer gray of eastern deciduous trees after the leaves had gone, the gray of a landscape that was between things, waiting for the next version of itself. She thought about Stokes, who had looked at her in the committee room and made his assessment and then paused at the door because the assessment had required revision. She thought about Breck, standing at the perimeter wire with his hands in his pockets, saying, "I know what I found," and leaving it there. She thought about Halder in the armory, cleaning a barrel that didn't need cleaning because the hands needed something to do while the model revised. She thought about Petrov, who had just watched. She closed the file and put on her jacket and went to the range. Okafor was there when she arrived. He was usually there before anyone else, which she had come to understand was not about the range, but about the particular peace that comes from being in a space you understand completely before the day introduces its complications. She set up the M200 without speaking. He watched without speaking. The range was empty except for them. The targets at distance in the gray morning, the particular silence of a precision range before the first shot. She got behind the rifle. The shoulder settled into the cheek weld without argument. The scope brought the distance to something manageable. The wind was coming from her left at 8 to 10 knots, shifting slightly. She read 3 flags in the first 20 seconds and built her picture. She thought about all of it for one moment. The briefing room and the silence and Breck's hand behind his mouth, the ridge and the cold and the machine gun emplacement at 892 meters, the AT-4 and the creek bed, and Draven's face in the dirt saying, "You are not who they told me you were." Then she let it go. All of it. Set it down the way her father had taught her. Not suppressed, not forgotten, just placed aside, because the present moment required everything she had, and it was not interested in sharing the space. She breathed. She pressed the trigger. The shot went exactly where she sent it. Okafor looked at the target through his spotting scope for a long moment. "Same as last week," he said. "Yes," she said. She reloaded. She got back behind the rifle. The gray morning held the range in its quiet, and the targets waited at their distances, and the wind continued doing what wind does, variable, honest, indifferent to preference. She was not the sniper they had underestimated. She was not the proof of anything. She was not the answer to the briefing room's silence or the revision of a file that had been built smaller than the truth. She was a woman with a rifle and a program to build, and a committee to convince, and a shoulder that was almost entirely healed, and a notebook with a name in it that she would carry for the rest of her professional life. She pressed the trigger again. The echo traveled out across the range and came back changed, the way sound does when it has touched something real. The world does not give you your place. You find it in the dark, under fire, when everyone who doubted you is watching and waiting for you to confirm what they believe. And you do the job anyway, not to prove them wrong, but because the job is worth doing and you are the one who can do it. That is the only credential that has ever mattered.